Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was late July, one of those sticky nights where the air feels like wet fabric and the sky never really goes black. I live just outside Springfield, Missouri, on the edge of a neighborhood that backs up to a patch of woods and farmland. It's quiet here, except for the highway about a mile off. That night, I was on my back porch watching a storm roll in. It had been building all evening. Low thunder, flashes on the horizon that barely lit up the fields. The power had already flickered twice, and the smell of ozone was so strong I could taste it. I like storms, always have. Usually, I sit out there until the rain drives me inside. But this one felt strange before it even really started. The first thing I noticed was how still it got. The crickets cut off mid-chirp. The leaves in the trees froze. Not a single breeze, not even a hum from the transformer at the end of the street. Everything went silent, and that silence seemed to stretch. I remember looking at my phone. It said 10:42. I was sitting on the porch steps, barefoot, a beer next to me, watching the clouds. They weren't rolling like normal storm clouds. They were layered, thick, flat on the bottom, like the whole sky was one solid ceiling. The lightning started again, distant but frequent, those kind that flash without thunder at first. Then came a bolt that hit somewhere nearby, close enough that the flash lit up everything white for half a second. I actually flinched, but what caught me wasn't the sound or the brightness. It was what I saw during that instant. For that half second, behind the clouds, there was something. Not a plane. Not a shape that made sense. It was huge. It didn't look solid exactly, but there was structure. Straight lines, hard edges, like something metallic and enormous was sitting above the tree line, half hidden in the clouds. When the flash faded, it was gone. The thunder came a few seconds later, sharp, echoing, and it shook the windows. I stood up, staring at the clouds, waiting for another bolt. I told myself it was just my eyes. Lightning does weird things to your vision. It can leave after images. But when the next flash came, I saw it again. Same spot, same shape, except this time it looked like it had shifted slightly. Not moved away, tilted. I froze. My beer tipped over on the step, but I didn't move to grab it. The thunder came again, but it felt delayed, like the sound was farther away than it should have been. I walked out into the yard without realizing it, bare feet sinking into wet grass. The storm was right overhead now, the clouds churning but low, almost too low. Another bolt, brighter, closer. And again, just behind the clouds, that shape. Not glowing, not lit up. It was just there, like the light from the lightning had outlined it. Massive, dark, curved on one side, but squared off on the other. It didn't make any sense. The rain started right after that, sudden and heavy, sheets of it slamming against the yard. I ran back up to the porch, half drenched, and stood under the awning, staring out. The wind kicked up out of nowhere. It was blowing in bursts, sharp and uneven, like it was being pushed rather than gusting naturally. Then something even stranger happened. I realized there was no thunder following the last lightning strike. None. Just silence and rain. I stayed there maybe 5 minutes, waiting. The lightning kept flashing in the distance now, but every time it did, the thunder came late, or not at all. Around 11, the rain slowed down. The storm seemed to drift east, and I was about to go inside when another flash hit. I braced for thunder. Nothing. And in that white instant, I saw it again, this time closer, almost directly overhead. It filled the whole patch of sky above my yard. I could see its underside, or at least the shadow of it through the thin clouds. Perfectly still, perfectly silent. The edges were sharp but didn't look mechanical in a normal way. There were no lights, no markings, no movement, just the impression of something enormous hanging there. Then it was gone. I ran inside, slammed the door, and stood by the kitchen window, breathing hard. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart pounding in my neck. I told myself to get a grip. It was just storm weirdness, tricks of the eye, cloud formations, whatever. But when I looked outside again, the rain had completely stopped. No wind, no thunder, nothing. And the clouds above the house, they weren't moving anymore. I swear to God, they were perfectly still, like someone had frozen them. It stayed like that for maybe a minute. Then I heard something faint, a low hum, almost like distant machinery. It wasn't coming from the highway or the power lines. It felt like it was coming from the sky. I went to the back window and peeked out toward the trees. Through the gaps, I could see flashes of lightning still far off, east of me. But above the woods behind my house, there was this faint shimmer, like heat distortion, only in the air, about treetop level. It pulsed once, just once. And then the rain started again. Hard. When the thunder finally returned, it was so loud it made the dishes in the cabinet rattle. I jumped back and didn't go near the window again for the rest of the night. The power went out around midnight. I sat in the dark for maybe half an hour before finally going to bed. I didn't sleep much. Every time lightning flashed through the curtains, I waited for the thunder to follow, and it never matched up. Sometimes it came too soon, sometimes not at all. By morning, everything was calm. The yard was soaked, small branches scattered around, but nothing major. The air smelled burnt, though. Not like ozone anymore, but like something electrical. When I went outside, the first thing I noticed was the trees at the back of the yard. The tops were bent slightly outward, all in the same direction, like a burst of air or pressure had pushed through them. There wasn't any damage, not really, just this weird, uniform bend that looked unnatural. I walked over and ran my hand along one of the trunks. It wasn't burned, not split, just leaning. That night I talked to my neighbor, Ed. He's in his 70s, been here longer than anyone. I asked if he'd seen the storm. He said, yeah, hell of a light show. You lose power too? I said, yeah. Then I asked if he'd noticed anything unusual. He thought about it for a second and said, well, the thunder sounded funny. So, like it was coming from one side only. Seemed off. That was it. He didn't mention seeing anything. A few days later, I checked online for storm reports. There were a couple of local posts about strange flashes and unusual cloud shapes, but nothing else. No news, no explanations. For the rest of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Every time a storm came through after that, I found myself standing at the back door, waiting for lightning, scanning the clouds. About 2 weeks later, another thunderstorm rolled in, smaller this time. I sat on the porch again, half hoping to see it, half dreading it. Around 10:30, a flash lit up the sky, and for an instant, I thought I saw the same outline, farther away this time, higher up, maybe behind the next ridge. It was just a shadow against the clouds, faint but unmistakable. No thunder followed. Then, as I stood there staring into the dark, I felt that same low hum again, soft, almost below hearing. It lasted maybe 5 seconds and faded. The thunder came back a few moments later, rolling and distant, perfectly normal. I stayed out there for another hour, but it never happened again. Now, every time I see lightning light up the horizon, I catch myself watching for that shape, half expecting it to show up again, just for a split second, hiding behind the clouds, waiting for another flash to give it away. It was around 10 at night, mid-September. The air just cool enough that you could sit outside with a hoodie and not get eaten alive by mosquitoes. I was out on my back porch with a beer, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of traffic from Route 22. My place sits at the edge of a little wooded patch that runs down into a creek. Behind that, it's just more trees and a few scattered houses about half a mile away. I was scrolling through my phone when I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a faint blue light in the woods. At first, I thought it was my neighbor's motion light, but it was deeper in, maybe 50 yards past the tree line. It wasn't steady either. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. I set my phone down and leaned forward. The glow faded for a few seconds, then came back, soft, bluish white and oddly even, not like a flashlight or car headlights bleeding through the trees. It lit up the branches from below like it was sitting on the ground. I watched it for maybe a minute, trying to figure out what could cause it. Kids with glow sticks? A phone screen? None of it really fit. The color was too pure and the pulse too regular. Then, when I stood up to get a better look, it went out. Not gradually, just blinked off. The woods went completely dark again, like it had never been there. I waited a while, half expecting it to come back on, but it didn't. I sat back down and tried to brush it off. maybe some kind of reflection. The neighbor's security lights flicker sometimes, and light carries weird through trees at night. About 10 minutes later, though, it came back. This time it was fainter and a little farther to the right, deeper into the trees. The same color, the same slow pulsing rhythm. It didn't light up much around it, just a hazy aura against the trunks. I got my flashlight from inside and pointed it toward the woods. The beam barely reached that far. I couldn't see anything except branches and leaves catching bits of the light. When I switched it off again, the glow was gone. I waited another minute. It came back, but not where it had been. It had moved maybe 20 feet to the left, same distance back. That's when it started to bother me. I went inside, grabbed my boots, and slipped them on. I wasn't planning to go deep into the woods, just to the edge where the grass meets the tree line. The night was so quiet I could hear the electric hum of the porch light behind me. As soon as I stepped off the porch, the glow faded. I froze, waiting. Nothing. I took a few more steps, crunching through the grass. The woods were just black shapes now, no sound, except the creak trickling somewhere below. I turned to head back, and as I did, I saw the glow again, faint but visible, back where I'd been sitting on the porch. For a second I thought maybe my eyes were messing with me, like they'd adjusted weirdly to the dark. But no, it was definitely there. A soft, steady pulse. It disappeared again when I took a few steps toward it. I stood there a while longer before going back inside. I didn't like how quiet it had gotten. Even the crickets had stopped. I locked the back door, turned off the porch light, and went upstairs. From the bedroom window, you can see down into the backyard and part of the woods. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek. The glow was there again. It was barely visible now, maybe halfway between the porch and the creek, still pulsing. I stared at it for what felt like several minutes, waiting for it to move. It didn't. I finally went to bed around midnight, though I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked down to where I thought the light had been. The grass was wet, and I didn't see any footprints or tire tracks. The ground under the trees looked normal too, except for a small patch of flattened leaves near the creek. No scorch marks, no debris, nothing that glowed in the daylight. I told myself it must have been something simple. Maybe one of those kids from up the road using a drone, though the light hadn't moved like a drone. Too steady, too slow. That night I was out on the porch again. I don't know why. Habit, I guess. I didn't expect to see it. But around the same time, a little after 10, it came back. Same place as before. Low to the ground, bluish-white, pulsing. It felt closer this time, though that might have just been my imagination. I watched it for a long time, trying to stay perfectly still. After a few minutes, I realized the pulse wasn't random. It had a pattern. 2 quick beats, then 1 longer. Pause. 2 quick, 1 long. It repeated like that for maybe a minute. Then it went dark. I waited for it to return, but instead, I heard something move in the trees. Not footsteps exactly, more like a single heavy shift, like a branch bending under weight. I held my breath, waiting for another sound, but the woods went silent again. The crickets had stopped just like before. When the glow came back, it was higher, maybe 6 or 7 feet off the ground. It hovered there, pulsing slow again, steady and calm. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed the reflection in my glass door. My own silhouette, still as stone, and behind it, the faintest blue shimmer like light diffused through fog, closer than it had been before. That broke me. I went inside, locked both doors, turned off the lights, and sat in the living room listening. I thought about calling someone, but who do you call for something like that? The sheriff? There's a weird light in the woods behind my house. It was quiet for a while, then the power flickered. Just for a second, the lamps dimmed, then came back. I checked my phone. The Wi-Fi had dropped. When I looked out the back window again, the glow was gone. The next morning, the backyard smelled faintly metallic, like when lightning hits close by. I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. That night, nothing showed up, or the night after. 3 days later, though, I woke up around 3 a.m. and saw the glow again, faint through the trees. Not pulsing this time, just steady. I stood at the window watching it for a long time. It seemed farther away, closer to the creek. Then it started to fade, slow this time, like it was sinking into the ground. I didn't go back to sleep after that. A week passed with nothing unusual. The woods went back to normal. Crickets, frogs, owls. Then one morning, I noticed something strange near the tree line. The grass in a wide circle, maybe 10 feet across, was lying flat. Not dead, just pressed down like something heavy had been set there. In the middle of it, the soil looked slightly darker, almost damp, though it hadn't rained in days. I walked around the edge but didn't step inside. Every time I got close to the center, my phone's flashlight flickered. Once or twice, the screen froze for a second before catching up. By that evening, the spot had already started to spring back up, the grass lifting like it was never flattened at all. I sat out again that night, not expecting much. Around 10:30, I caught a faint bluish flicker near the same spot. Not a full glow this time, just a dim pulse like something trying to push through. It blinked twice, then nothing. That was the last time I saw it. Now, when I sit on the porch, I sometimes think I see a faint shimmer out there, but it's probably just fireflies or headlights catching through the trees. The woods are quiet again, except for the creek and the usual night sounds. Still, every once in a while, if I leave my phone on the table and look at the reflection in the glass door, there's this faint blue tint, almost invisible, that fades when I move. I tell myself it's just the light from the TV or my phone screen, but I've stopped sitting out there after dark. I was driving back from my cousin's place in Spencer County. It was late, close to midnight, and I'd stayed longer than I meant to. The route back home wound through farmland, no streetlights, no traffic, just long, empty stretches of two-lane road. It was clear that night, a little cold, with the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I had the radio on low, mostly just to keep myself awake. I remember glancing down at the clock on the dash, 11:52. I wasn't far from home, maybe 15 minutes out. My headlights were the only thing breaking the dark, cutting through fields on either side. That's when the beams suddenly dimmed, not like they flickered. They just faded to this dull yellow, weak and sick-looking, as if the battery was dying. My first thought was the alternator, but the engine didn't stall. The car kept running smooth as ever. I checked the dashboard, no warning lights. I turned off the radio, then back on. Everything worked fine. The headlights stayed dim for a good few seconds, and that's when I noticed something else. The air felt heavy, like the kind of weight you feel before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear. Then, in the distance, down in the valley that stretched below the road, every single light flickered. It wasn't gradual or scattered like a power surge. Every farmhouse porch light, barn light, even the faint glow from what must have been a gas station in the distance, all of them pulsed at once, just a single synchronized flicker. Then everything went back to normal. The headlights brightened again right after that, full strength, like nothing happened. I pulled over on the shoulder, trying to make sense of it. I left the engine idling and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my boots. The night was so still, I could hear cows lowing somewhere far off. I looked down toward the valley. Nothing seemed out of place. No smoke, no sound, just quiet farms under a pale moon. I got back in the car and drove another couple miles, half convinced I'd imagined it. But then it happened again. This time, it started with the lights dimming. Not as bad, but enough that I noticed. I checked the dash clock. 12:01. The radio popped with static and a faint high-pitched tone came through, steady and weirdly clean, like the test sound you hear before a weather alert. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then silence. Right after that, a light flashed in the valley. It wasn't lightning. It was too focused, too white. It looked like someone turned on a massive floodlight for just a second. It came from somewhere behind a tree line near the base of the hills. I waited for it to happen again, but it didn't. The radio hissed softly, and the tone didn't return. I slowed down when I hit the next curve, watching that stretch of valley through the passenger window. Then, just for a moment, I saw a smaller light moving low along the trees. At first, I thought it was a truck's headlight, but it wasn't bouncing or following a road. It was drifting, smooth and silent, just above the treetops. I pulled over again, heart pounding, and turned off the engine. The quiet that followed was unreal. No wind, no crickets, no hum from the engine, just this thick silence pressing in from every direction. The light moved slower now, almost like it was hovering. It wasn't bright enough to hurt my eyes, just steady and pale, the color of cold metal under moonlight. I remember leaning across the seat, trying to see if there were beams or wires or anything holding it up. Nothing. Just that shape moving against the black trees. Then, like before, all the valley lights blinked off and on, perfectly synchronized. When they came back, the drifting light was gone. I sat there for a long minute, gripping the steering wheel. I thought about calling someone, my cousin maybe, but what would I even say? Hey, I think I saw a floating light and all the power went out? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Eventually I started driving again, slower this time. The road curved higher up along the ridge, giving me a clear view of the valley below. I kept glancing over, expecting to see that light again. Half a mile later, I spotted something strange. The far end of the valley, near the river bend, had this faint glow hanging just above it. Not like normal light pollution. It was too contained. It looked like fog lit from underneath, soft and uniform. The more I stared, the more wrong it felt, like it wasn't lighting up the trees or reflecting off the water. It was just hanging there, detached from everything else. I pulled off again, engine idling, and rolled down the window. The air smelled sharp, like ozone after lightning. I killed the engine completely to listen. That's when I realized the usual night sounds were missing again. No frogs, no insects, no wind moving through the grass. Just dead silence. A minute passed, then from the direction of that glow, I heard a deep, slow humming. It didn't sound mechanical. It was steady, low frequency, almost like it was inside my chest instead of in the air. It kept going, 5, maybe 6 seconds, then faded out. Right after that, the glow dimmed. One side of it shrank faster than the other, like something huge was rotating or turning away. Then it was gone, leaving only moonlight and empty fields. When I started the car again, the radio came back on by itself, volume high. The same clear tone as before was playing, constant, smooth. Then it cut to static. The headlights flickered once more as I hit the next stretch of road, then steadied. I passed a farmhouse a few minutes later, lights on inside. I actually considered stopping, just to make sure I wasn't losing it, but it felt wrong somehow. Like if I stepped out, everything would stop again. The sound, the air, maybe even the lights in that house. I kept driving. By the time I hit the highway junction, it was 12:43. I should have reached that spot in 20 minutes from where I'd been parked earlier, but it felt shorter than that. My phone's clock showed 12:43 too. I don't know why, but that bothered me. It didn't feel like that much time had passed. The rest of the drive was quiet. No more flickering, no more lights, no hum. When I finally got home, I turned off the car and sat there in the driveway for a while. The power was on in my house, porch light steady, nothing strange, but the air still smelled faintly like rain, even though it hadn't rained all week. And there was this faint vibration under the car, like the ground itself was trembling just a little. It stopped after a few seconds. I went inside, turned on every light, and just stood in the kitchen listening. The fridge hummed, the clock ticked, everything was normal again. The next morning, I checked the news and local weather. No mention of outages, no storms, nothing unusual reported anywhere in the county. But later that day, when I drove back out to meet a friend, I passed that same stretch of road. The valley looked normal, except for one thing. A line of trees near the base of the hill was bent slightly outward, like something large and heavy had pushed through from above. Not broken, not burned, just bent, all in the same direction. I slowed down and stared at them as I passed, trying to figure out if they'd always looked like that. I couldn't tell. I haven't seen anything like it since. But sometimes, late at night, when I drive through that valley, my headlights dip for just a second, and I catch myself glancing down toward the fields, half expecting every light down there to flicker again. It was around 9 on a Sunday night when my phone rang. I was on the couch half asleep, some show playing low on the TV. It was my friend Erin, who lives a few blocks over. She sounded weirdly out of breath. "Are you home right now?" she asked. "Yeah." "Why?" "There's something above your street. Like a light. It's just hovering there." I sat up. "What kind of light?" "I don't know. It's not moving, but it's not right. Just go outside and look. You'll see it." She hung up before I could ask more. At first, I figured she was messing with me. She and her husband had been drinking earlier at a barbecue, so it wouldn't have surprised me. But curiosity got the better of me. I threw on some shoes and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool for late August, a faint breeze moving through the trees. The street was empty, just a few porch lights glowing down the block. I looked up, no light, nothing hovering. I walked down to the end of my driveway and scanned the sky. Still nothing, just a few stars and the dull orange haze from the city to the east. But then I noticed something else. About 20 feet down the road, right in the middle of the asphalt, there was this patch of leaves. Dry, brown, brittle, slowly swirling in a perfect circle. It wasn't windy. I even held my hand out trying to feel any air movement, but there wasn't any. The leaves just kept spinning, silently, in a tight ring maybe 3 feet wide. I walked a little closer, just far enough to see it clearly under the streetlight. The movement wasn't chaotic like how wind scatters things. It was smooth, controlled. They moved in an unbroken pattern, counterclockwise at a steady pace. There wasn't a single sound coming from them. That part stuck out most. Even though they were scraping across the road, there was no noise, no rustle, no drag, no dry crackling like you'd expect. Just silence. I called Erin back. She picked up right away. "Hey, I'm outside," I said. "I don't see any light, but there's something weird in the road." "Wait, it's not there anymore," she said. "It was huge, like a floodlight above your street. I could see it from my window." "When?" "Like 30 seconds ago. It was just there, hovering. Then it blinked out. That's why I called." I stared at the swirling leaves. "Well, something's still happening. I think whatever you saw was right over this spot." She went quiet. Then she said, "You should go inside." I hung up and crouched down near the edge of the curb. The circle was still going, exactly the same speed. A couple leaves drifted up higher for a moment as if caught by a draft, but again, there was no wind. I pulled out my phone to record, but the moment I opened the camera, the screen flickered. The image froze, then the whole phone restarted. When it came back on, the leaves were still spinning, but slower now. The motion had tightened, almost like they were closing in toward a center point. Then, as I watched, the circle collapsed in on itself, the leaves all dropping flat to the pavement in perfect unison. I stepped forward and nudged one with my shoe. Dry, brittle, ordinary. The silence broke then. Crickets started up again, and a dog barked a few houses away. I stood there for a while longer before going back inside. A few minutes later, Erin texted me. "It's back." I ran out the front door again, but this time there was no circle, no leaves moving. Just the faintest bluish-white light hanging above the trees, about 100 feet up. It was perfectly still. Not a drone, not a plane, just hovering. It didn't flicker or move, but it wasn't solid either. It looked like light without a source, like someone had taken a spotlight and aimed it straight down into thin air. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds before it blinked out. No sound, no fading, just gone. When I looked back at the road, the circle of leaves was back, only now it wasn't in the same spot. It was about 10 feet closer to my house, spinning the same way, the same perfect motion. The air around me felt heavy, like the pressure before a storm. My ears popped slightly. I couldn't tell if it was from nerves or something else. I took a step backward. The circle slowed. I stepped forward again, and it sped up. That's when I realized the leaves weren't just turning in place. They were moving closer to me, inch by inch, as if the circle itself was creeping along the road. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally moved. I backed all the way to my porch, watching it drift closer, slow and deliberate, until it reached the edge of the curb. Then it just stopped. No sound, no light, nothing. I stayed outside another few minutes, but nothing else happened. The leaves just lay there, scattered in a rough patch like they'd been dropped from above. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about Erin's description, a floodlight over the street, and wondering if what she'd seen had caused whatever I'd witnessed afterward. The next morning, I went out early to look at the spot. The leaves were still there, but they were damp, like dew had settled on them heavier than everywhere else. When I brushed them aside with my shoe, the asphalt underneath was lighter, a perfect pale ring where the circle had been. I crouched down and touched it. The surface felt smooth, almost waxy, unlike the rough texture of the rest of the road. I took a picture this time. My phone didn't glitch, but when I looked at the photo later, the ring didn't show up. The spot looked perfectly normal. That night, Erin came by to see it for herself. I showed her where the circle had been, though by then the color difference had faded. She said, "You think maybe it was some kind of downburst, like static electricity or something?" I just shook my head. No wind, no sound, nothing moved except the leaves. She looked up at the trees above the street. That's exactly where the light was, right above that spot. It was bright enough that I could see your driveway from my window. We stood there for a bit, not saying much. A couple cars passed, their headlights washing over the asphalt. Nothing unusual. But when we turned to go back inside, I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like dry leaves dragging across pavement. We both stopped. The sound came again, soft but steady, from farther down the road. When we looked, there was nothing. Just a few leaves skittering here and there in the breeze, except there was no breeze. Aaron whispered, "Do you see that?" Near the next streetlight, about 50 feet away, another small cluster of leaves was turning in a slow, deliberate circle. We didn't go closer this time. We just watched from my driveway as the circle tightened, sped up slightly, then froze. The leaves dropped all at once, same as before. Aaron backed toward my porch. "Let's go inside." We sat in the kitchen after that, not talking much. After a while, she left, and I locked every door. Nothing else happened that night or the next. But 3 days later, when I was backing out of my driveway in the morning, my dashboard lights flickered, just for a second, and I noticed a small, faint spiral of leaves at the corner of the intersection. Same motion, same silence. I watched it through the windshield until it stopped. That was about a month ago. Since then, I've seen smaller versions of it a few times. In the park, along the sidewalk, near the creek, once in the middle of a parking lot. Always silent, always perfectly circular. They never last long, and no one else ever seems to notice them. I don't tell people anymore when I see them. I just watch until they stop, then go about my day. The weirdest part, though, is the smell. Every time it happens, there's this faint, sharp odor, like hot dust on metal, that lingers in the air afterward. It fades quick, but once you've noticed it, you can't ignore it. Last night, I caught that same smell when I stepped out to grab the mail. The street was empty, quiet, still, but there was a single dry leaf sitting in the middle of the road, spinning slowly in place. It was a red-eye from Seattle to Chicago, middle of February, one of those flights where everyone's half asleep before the plane even leaves the ground. I'd been in Seattle for work and had an early meeting the next morning, so I took the cheapest flight I could find, aisle seat, 25B. The flight left around 11:40 p.m. The cabin lights dimmed right after takeoff, and most people went quiet. I couldn't sleep, though. I never can on planes. I just scrolled through my phone, read a few emails, that kind of thing. About 40 minutes in, I leaned over to stretch and glanced toward the window. The guy in 25A, younger guy, headphones in, hoodie up, was asleep. His window shade was halfway open. I could see the faint glow of the wing lights and the usual black void beyond. But as we started banking east, something caught my eye. It looked like another plane flying below us, a little to the right, maybe a few thousand feet down. It wasn't flashing like normal aircraft lights. It just had this dull white glow, almost like it was lit from the inside. At first, I figured it was a reflection from our own lights, but as I watched, it stayed exactly in sync with us. Every small turn, every angle of descent or correction, it mirrored us perfectly. I waited for it to drift away or change position, but it didn't. It just kept following. I leaned closer to the window, squinting past the reflection of the cabin lights. I could make out its shape better then, oval, or maybe like a teardrop seen from above. No wings, no tail, just a smooth, faintly glowing form keeping pace with us, steady as a shadow. I sat back and tried to play it off. Could have been another flight on a parallel route, maybe at a different altitude. That happens all the time. But when the captain came on a few minutes later to say we'd be adjusting course slightly for weather, I felt the plane turn, and the light below turned with it, perfectly. Not delayed, not off by even a second. I stared at it for a long time. My eyes kept adjusting between the darkness and the glow. I remember thinking how oddly bright it looked for being that far below. It wasn't blinding or anything, just clear, defined. I finally nudged the guy next to me. "Hey, sorry. You mind if I look out the window for a sec?" He mumbled something, lifted the shade all the way up, and leaned back to sleep again. I pressed my face closer to the glass. It was still there. We were probably over Montana by then, miles of nothing but dark. No towns, no lights below us. Just this thing gliding under us like a reflection that shouldn't exist. The weirdest part was how constant it was. We hit some turbulence, little jolts, and it kept moving smooth and steady like the bumps didn't affect it. I thought about getting a flight attendant, but the rational part of my brain kept saying, "You're tired, it's late, it's just some weird light phenomenon." Then the seatbelt sign came on, and the captain's voice came through again. "Folks, we're getting reports of some unexpected crosswinds at this altitude, so we're going to climb a bit." The engines deepened, the plane tilted upward, and that glowing thing followed. Same rate of climb. Same distance below. I felt something in my stomach twist. I watched it what felt like 20 minutes, but could have been less. The longer I looked, the less sure I was of the scale. At times it seemed far below us, other times closer, like it was rising or shrinking. The glow had this pulsing quality, slow, almost like breathing, but not rhythmic enough to be mechanical. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I'd imagined it, everything outside went pitch black. Not cloudy dark, just gone. The glow, the faint horizon, all of it disappeared for maybe 2 seconds. When the view came back, the glowing shape was gone. I blinked a few times and leaned closer to the window. Nothing. Just stars and the red light blinking on our wingtip. I sat back, trying to decide if I just zoned out. Maybe I'd been staring too long and my eyes had played tricks on me. Then, maybe 5 minutes later, I caught a flicker. Far off to the left this time. The same dull, white glow, smaller but moving fast. It zipped parallel to us for a few seconds, then slowed and matched speed again. That was when I noticed something else. The cabin felt quiet. Not just the usual hum of the engines, but like everything had dampened. My ears popped slightly. No one else around me seemed to notice. A couple people were sleeping, a few had headphones in. The glow drifted closer, angling beneath our wing. I leaned as far as I could to keep it in view. It hovered there, steady, until I realized it wasn't lighting up the wing at all. The glow didn't reflect on anything. It was like light that didn't interact with the plane or the air or anything around it. The engines made a deep, low whine, and I felt a slight shudder. Not turbulence exactly, more like the pressure shifted. I looked back out and saw that the glow had risen higher, almost level with us now. And that's when the guy in the window seat finally stirred. He rubbed his eyes, leaned toward the window, and froze. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I said, "You see it too?" He nodded slowly. "It's been following us?" "Yeah, for a while." We both watched in silence as it drifted closer, until it was about parallel with the wing. Still no detail to it, just this smooth white oval, faintly pulsating. Then, without warning, the entire cabin lights flickered. Just once. Half a second. When they came back on, the glow was gone. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but didn't. After a few seconds, he pulled his shade down and just sat there, staring at the seat in front of him. I stayed awake the rest of the flight, watching through the tiny gap where the shade didn't fully close. I didn't see it again until we started descending toward Chicago. We were lower now, clouds beneath us, lights of small towns starting to appear. As the plane banked to line up with the runway, I saw the glow again, this time above us, faint and distant, moving in the opposite direction. No one else reacted. It was gone before I could even tap the window guy again. When we landed, I felt drained. Everyone else just grabbed their bags and shuffled off, yawning, stretching. I didn't say anything to anyone. I tried to check flight radar later that morning, see if any planes had been on a similar route, maybe a refueling jet or military craft. Nothing. The airspace below our path was empty at that time. I didn't think about it again for a while. Then about 3 weeks later, I was on another night flight, this time from Denver to Atlanta, and I caught myself glancing out the window more than usual. It was clear that night, no clouds, lots of stars. Halfway through the flight, I saw it again. Same dull white glow, same slow pace, this time much farther away. I didn't point it out to anyone. It didn't follow us for long, maybe 5 minutes. Then it faded out, like someone dimmed a light until it disappeared. When we landed, I checked the window reflection on the inside of the plane to make sure there wasn't something that could have explained it. A reflection from a phone, a reading light, anything. But there wasn't. I even tried to recreate it a week later on a short evening flight back home. I booked the window seat this time, watched the reflection patterns, looked for other planes. Nothing ever matched what I saw. The glow hasn't shown up again since then, but I still catch myself looking for it, especially during turns. Those moments when the plane tilts just enough to give you a view of the dark below. There's this instant where everything outside the window is black, just the faint curve of the wing, and I almost expect to see that dull, pale shape keeping pace underneath us, following every move like a mirror. When I woke up that morning, I thought the power had just gone out overnight. My alarm clock was blinking 12, the usual sign. It's one of those cheap digital ones with the green numbers, and I've had it for years. I figured the storm from the night before had knocked something out, so I reached for my phone to check the time. It said 4:52 a.m. That was early, but fine. I decided to get up and reset the clock anyway. I went to the kitchen to grab some water, and as I passed the microwave, I noticed it said 4:56. I froze. I thought maybe I'd misread it, so I stared for a second, then looked back down at my phone. Still 4:52. I checked the stove clock next. 4:48. That's when I got a weird feeling in my chest. Not panic exactly, but that same nervous awareness you get when something's off and your brain is trying to find a reason fast. I remember just standing there in my kitchen, barefoot, trying to do the math. I checked my phone's Wi-Fi, thinking maybe it hadn't synced right or something, but it had full service and auto time was on. I went into the living room. The wall clock there said 4:44. I actually laughed a little because it felt ridiculous. 4 clocks, all different times, each 4 minutes apart from the next. Bedroom 12, phone 4:52, stove 4:48, microwave 4:56, wall clock 4:44. It didn't make any sense. I figured maybe the power flickered a few times and messed with them differently, but that didn't explain my phone. I decided to double check the Wi-Fi router since it might have rebooted too. The small green lights were steady, no sign of a reset. It was dead quiet except for the refrigerator humming. Outside the window, everything looked normal. The faint orange glow from the streetlights, a light drizzle still coming down. My neighborhood's quiet that early, so I couldn't hear anything but the rain. I opened my laptop to see if it matched my phone's time. It didn't. It said 4:40. That one hit me a little. I know computer clocks sync automatically. I opened the World Clock website. It said 4:52, same as my phone. So why was my laptop running 12 minutes behind? I sat there staring at the screen, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe the CMOS battery inside was dying? But that wouldn't happen suddenly, and I hadn't noticed any issues before. I was fully awake by then, heart going a little faster. I checked my watch, an old Casio I keep by the door. 4:48, same as the stove. That's when I realized every clock in the house was not just random. They were separated exactly 4 minutes apart. 4:44, 4:48, 4:52, 4:56. Even the dead one in my bedroom, when I thought about it, could fit the pattern if you considered it might have lost power exactly 4 minutes before the others. I didn't know what to make of that, but it was too specific to be a coincidence. I walked room to room, checking again. Everything matched that same spacing. Even the one on my thermostat screen showed 40. I kept glancing at them like maybe they'd shift back into alignment while I wasn't looking. They didn't. Then I heard something. A soft, dull thump from outside. Not loud, but enough to make me stop. It sounded like something hitting wet grass. I turned off the kitchen light and peered out the window, but all I could see were faint reflections and rain streaks on the glass. I went to the sliding door and looked through the blinds. There was a light in the backyard. Not bright, more like a faint white glow low to the ground, maybe where the shed was. At first, I thought it was my neighbor's motion light, but it wasn't that yellow tone. It was flat, like it didn't really light up anything around it, just hung there, maybe 20 feet out. I tried to convince myself it was a reflection, maybe my phone screen or a car's headlights through the trees. But there weren't any cars, no movement, just that pale light sitting in the mist. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it. Then, without me doing anything, the clock on the microwave beeped. I turned my head fast. It was back to 12. Then the stove did the same thing, reset to blinking zeros. The sound was soft, but in that moment it felt deafening. The living room clock had stopped. I checked my phone again. 4:52, same as before. When I looked back out the window, the light was gone. Everything after that felt weirdly slow. I remember walking outside onto the deck with an umbrella, trying to see if maybe the shed light had shorted out or something. The grass was soaked. The shed door was slightly open, which bothered me because I always latch it. I didn't see any cables, no reflection, nothing glowing anymore. Just wet wood and the sound of rain hitting the umbrella. When I stepped closer, I noticed something else. A faint humming. Low, steady, not like machinery. It seemed to come from above me. I tilted my head back, but the clouds were thick and dark, barely visible against the faint orange sky glow. The hum wasn't directional, it just filled the air. I stayed there maybe a minute, just listening. Then, as quietly as it started, it stopped. No fade, just gone. When I went back inside, every clock in the house was dead. The digital ones were blank, like they'd lost power, but the power wasn't out. The lights worked fine. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to process everything. Then I checked my phone again. 5:16. I could have sworn only a few minutes had passed. The weirdest part, I wasn't scared at that moment, just unsettled. My head felt heavy, like I'd stayed up all night. I tried calling my friend Alex, who works nights, to ask if they'd had any storms or outages, but the call didn't go through. Just a fast, busy tone I hadn't heard in years. I tried again, same thing. I texted instead. The message showed as sending for maybe 10 minutes, then delivered all at once along with 3 old notifications from earlier in the day that popped up like they'd been delayed. Eventually, the clocks came back on by themselves. Every single one. But now, they all matched perfectly, 5:48 a.m. That was the last strange thing that happened that morning. By sunrise, everything looked normal again. I checked the shed later in the day. No signs of damage, no burn marks or footprints, nothing out of place except the latch bent slightly like it had been pulled from the outside. I reset all the clocks manually just to be sure. They've stayed synced ever since. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I check them all again, one by one. Not because I expect them to be different, but because I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that morning, the noise, the light, the time shift, wasn't finished. A few weeks later, I brought it up casually with Alex. They laughed it off, said storms can mess with power and time settings. I wanted to believe that. But I never told them about the light behind the shed, or that moment outside when the hum seemed to come from the clouds. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd walked further into the yard that night, if I'd gone toward where the light was. Sometimes when the power flickers now, even for a split second, I get this reflexive sense that something's off again, like I should check every clock before they line up on their own. I don't know what happened that night, but I know the feeling when it started. That split second of wrongness when you wake up and realize time doesn't agree with itself. It's quiet, almost invisible, but it's there. I was hiking alone near Eagle Cap Wilderness in northeastern Oregon. It was mid-October, cool but not cold yet, and the trails were pretty much empty except for a couple of bow hunters I passed earlier that morning. I'd started from the Two-Pan trailhead around sunrise, planning to make it up to a small alpine lake I'd camped at once before. The air had that sharp, dry smell that happens before snow season. By the time I got a few miles in, I stopped noticing the cold. It was one of those perfect hikes where your mind just drifts. I wasn't in a rush, just following the switchbacks, checking the map every now and then. Around 11 a.m., some thin clouds started rolling over the peaks, so the light went flat and gray. I remember it because that's when everything started feeling a little strange, not in a dramatic way, just still. No wind, no birds, not even the usual chatter of chipmunks. It wasn't totally silent, just muffled somehow, like everything was dampened. About half an hour later, I got off the main trail. I'd seen what looked like an open patch through the trees and thought it might be a good shortcut toward the ridge. The forest there was pretty thick with lodgepole pine, but there was a faint game trail, so I followed it uphill. It curved left, then opened into a clearing that I swear wasn't on any topo map I'd looked at. It was perfectly circular, maybe 50 yards across. The ground was rocky, with patches of grass and moss, but no fallen branches, no dead wood, nothing scattered around like you'd expect. I stepped into it and immediately noticed how strange it felt under my boots. The ground was colder than it should have been. Not just shady forest floor cold, but like the air above it had been drained of warmth. Then I looked up. Every single tree around the edge of the clearing had its top branches stripped bare. The trunks were normal, up to maybe 30 feet high, but past that, the bark looked scorched, almost polished. The upper branches were gone, not broken, just gone. Like something had burned or melted them off, but there were no burn marks on the lower parts, no smoke smell either. The tops looked skeletal against the clouds. I thought maybe lightning had hit a few of them, but it was too uniform. The same height, the same radius, all the way around. I crouched down to touch the soil, cold, like metal that's been sitting in a freezer. I pressed my palm into the moss, and it was damp, but not frozen, just unnaturally cool. I even checked the thermometer on my pack, 52 degrees. The ground felt at least 20 degrees colder. That's when I realized I couldn't hear anything. Total silence. No wind, no leaves moving. Even my own breathing sounded off, like it wasn't echoing right. I stayed there maybe a minute, trying to make sense of it. The rational part of my brain was saying there had to be an explanation. Microclimate, weird soil composition, maybe even a controlled burn years ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. Then I noticed something else. In the center of the clearing, the moss and grass formed a perfect depression. Not a hole, just a shallow circular dip, maybe a foot deep, like something heavy had once sat there and compressed it evenly. I stepped closer. The air seemed colder there too, like it dropped a few more degrees with every step. I could see my breath even though the forest around me wasn't that cold. The first really unnerving thing happened when I crouched to look at the center. The forest edge shimmered. Not dramatically, just a slight distortion, like heat haze. It ran along the tree line for about a second, then was gone. The air was still cold. I stood up fast and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but I had this creeping sense that something had just changed. The light, maybe? I can't describe it. It was like the shadows shifted direction slightly, but there was no sun visible through the clouds. I backed up toward the edge of the clearing. As soon as I stepped past that ring of stripped trees, the temperature felt normal again. I turned around to look one more time, and that's when I noticed a smell. Faint, metallic, almost like ozone after lightning. But the air had been perfectly still. I kept walking. I didn't run, but I put distance between me and that spot fast. After maybe 10 minutes, I realized I'd lost the faint game trail I'd followed in. My GPS still worked though, so I checked it and started angling back toward the main trail. I remember the screen flickering once when I pulled it out, just a quick blink, but it came back fine. A few hundred yards later, I came across something that stopped me again. A patch of pine needles all pointing the same direction, like they'd been magnetized somehow. They weren't disturbed by wind. They were stuck that way, aligned east-west. I tested one with the tip of my knife. It lifted easily, but the others stayed in place. I didn't touch anything else. Just kept walking until I hit the main trail again. It took about 40 minutes to get back to my car at the trailhead. The whole time, I kept glancing behind me because I had the weirdest sensation that someone was walking parallel, just out of sight. No footsteps, just presence. Every time I stopped, it felt like the air paused too. When I got to the lot, mine was the only vehicle there. The clouds had thickened and it was starting to snow lightly. I opened the trunk to toss my pack in, and when I turned around, I noticed my watch had stopped. 12:37 p.m., dead. My phone still worked. 1:04 p.m. I sat in the car for a while before driving off, just trying to process what had happened. My hands were trembling, not from cold. It wasn't fear exactly, just this deep unease, like I'd been somewhere I wasn't supposed to see. On the drive out, a few miles down the dirt road, my radio picked up a strange interference. It wasn't static, more like a pulsing tone. Low, rhythmic, almost like breathing through a vent. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then cut out. I turned the radio off. When I got home that evening, I checked the GPS route I'd recorded. Everything was there except for about 10 minutes of missing data right around the time I'd been in the clearing. The track just froze in place, then resumed on the opposite side. I thought maybe the device had lost signal, but the sky had been open enough for satellites. I tried to find that clearing again on satellite maps. Nothing, just continuous forest. A few weeks later, I went back with my friend Nate. We hiked the same route, used the same GPS track. When we got near where I thought the clearing should be, there was nothing but trees, no circular patch, no stripped branches, no depression in the ground. The forest looked normal, maybe too normal, like it had always been that way. I didn't tell Nate everything, just said I'd seen something weird up there. He shrugged it off, said maybe I'd wandered into an old burn area that regrew unevenly. I wanted to believe that, but I kept thinking about the cold ground and that perfect ring of bare treetops. That night, after we got back, I pulled my watch out of my pack to replace the battery. When I opened the back, the inside was fine. No corrosion, nothing broken. I popped a new battery in and it started ticking again immediately. But the time it showed wasn't the current one. It was 12:37 p.m., exactly where it had stopped. I don't know what I found out there, but sometimes when I drive through that part of Oregon, I get the same faint ozone smell through the vents. Metallic, electric, always when the air's cold and the sky's flat gray. I haven't gone back up that trail since. We were camping out near Red Rock Canyon in Nevada. Me, my girlfriend Brooke, and two friends, Mason and Kira. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment weekend trips where no one plans anything properly. We drove out Friday evening, set up tents at a free site just outside the park boundary, and cracked open some beers while the sky turned that deep orange you only get in the desert. By 10, it was pitch dark except for the small fire we'd built. The four of us sat around it half talking, half zoning out. No music, just wind and that weird, soft hiss the sand makes when it moves. Mason was messing with his phone's night mode, trying to get a time-lapse of the stars. I remember because he kept swearing about the focus. Around 11, the wind started to pick up. It wasn't bad, just enough to make the tent fabric snap. Brooke and Kira climbed in early. Mason and I stayed up a little longer, talking about work and how quiet it was. You could see for miles in every direction. No cars, no flashlights, no distant headlights. Just the kind of stillness that feels empty and heavy at the same time. When I finally crawled into the tent, Brooke was already half asleep. I put my phone on airplane mode like I always do when camping and stuck it in the corner of the tent next to hers. I remember checking the time, 11:47. The fire outside had died down to orange coals. I must have dozed off pretty quick because the next thing I knew, I heard Brooke whispering my name. Not shaking me, not scared, just a quiet, "Eli, wake up." I rolled over and saw her phone screen glowing in the dark. She was holding it in front of her, but she wasn't touching it. The camera was open and recording. I thought she must have rolled on it by accident, but then mine lit up too. I hadn't touched it. The screen came on, camera open, and started recording video automatically. The sound of both phones clicking into record mode was clear, that little double beep. At first I thought maybe it was a glitch from the same app or something, but Brooke doesn't even use the same brand phone as me. Hers is Android, mine's iPhone. Then Mason yelled from his tent. Not loud, just a confused, guys?" Kira answered immediately, same tone. You could hear the confusion in her voice. We all unzipped our tents and stepped out at nearly the same time. The wind had totally died. Not slowed, stopped. The air was dead still, like someone had hit pause. All four of our phones were recording, screens pointed upward. I held mine up. The camera was focused on one patch of the sky straight above us. I tried to drag the screen, but the image wouldn't move. It was locked on that one spot. Mason swore and tried to close his app. It didn't respond. He even hard reset the phone, and when it powered back on, it went straight into the camera and started recording again. We all just stood there watching these little glowing rectangles in our hands aimed at the same dark section of sky. There weren't any stars in that spot, not even a faint one, just a blank void above us. After maybe 30 seconds, Brooke said, "It's cold." And she was right. The air had gone icy like a sudden draft, but there was no wind. I remember looking down and seeing the sand around my boots shimmer faintly, like static moving through it. Then Mason's phone made this weird feedback sound, not from the speaker, but like the mic was picking up a tone we couldn't hear. A faint whine that rose and fell in waves. Brooke's phone started doing the same thing a second later. Kira whispered, "Do you guys see that?" I followed her gaze upward. There wasn't anything obvious, just that same dark patch. But it didn't look like sky anymore. It looked textured somehow, like a layer of smoke you could almost see through. Every few seconds, a ripple moved across it. No one spoke for maybe a full minute. Then all four phones stopped recording at the exact same second, just froze on a frame, then shut off completely. The sound came back after that, the wind, the crackle of the dying fire. Brooke was shaking, but not from cold. She handed me her phone. It wouldn't turn on. None of ours would. All four were dead, even though I'd charged mine before we left. We sat by the fire after that, no one saying much. Mason kept glancing up like he expected something to reappear. I kept thinking I saw faint flashes in that same part of the sky, but they were probably just lightning way off in the distance. Around 2 a.m., Kira tried her phone again. It powered on, but the screen was laggy, and when she opened her gallery, there was a new folder labeled DCIM0. Inside were two short videos. Both were completely black, except for a faint pulse of light every few seconds, like a heartbeat behind fog. You could hear a low hum on the audio, steady and mechanical, not wind or static. The timestamps were strange too. Both showed 12:03 a.m., even though it was closer to midnight when it all happened. Mason's phone eventually turned back on. Same thing. Two videos, same time, same faint pulse of light. Mine and Brooks didn't record anything, at least not that we could find. Just a small system log that said, "Camera active 00004. We didn't go back to sleep after that. Mason kept stoking the fire even though we were out of wood, feeding it with cardboard and bits of our food wrappers just to have light. Every few minutes, he'd look at his phone screen again, like something new might appear. Just before dawn, we all decided to pack up early. The sun coming up over the ridge felt like a relief. We drove into town, stopped at a diner in Beatty, and plugged the phones into the wall chargers. They all booted up fine. The videos were still there, but something about them had changed. The pulse of light was slower, and the audio was gone. Just silence now. Mason transferred his copies to his laptop later that day, but when he played them back, both were blank. No light, no sound. The files existed, but they were just 2 minutes of nothing. I didn't really think about it again until 2 nights later. I was at home, scrolling through my own camera roll, deleting random stuff to free up space. I found a hidden system file I hadn't noticed before. Same folder name, DCIM0. It had one photo inside. It was of the night sky, but the stars were wrong. They didn't match anything visible from that latitude. A faint circular blur hovered in the center of the frame, almost invisible unless you adjusted the brightness. I didn't take it. The metadata said 12:03 a.m., same as the videos. I showed Brooke. She didn't say much, just stared at it for a long time. Then she asked if she could delete it. I said sure, but when she tried, the screen froze for a second, then the photo disappeared on its own. The next morning, Mason texted me, open quote, "Kira's phone won't stay off. It keeps turning the camera on by itself." Close quote. He sent me a screenshot. You could see the live view, same patch of black sky reflected from his back porch. 2 days later, he said it stopped. The phone was fine again. I checked mine that night. Nothing weird, no new photos, but when I opened the camera, it jerked upward for half a second, like it was trying to refocus on something above me. I shut it off immediately. A week after that trip, we all agreed not to talk about it anymore. It sounded crazy when we tried. Still, sometimes when I'm outside late, even just walking the dog, I catch myself glancing up at that same part of the sky, the spot where everything locked on. It looks normal. Stars, planes, satellites moving like usual. But every once in a while, there's a blank gap where nothing twinkles, like a dead pixel in the night. I don't point my phone that way anymore. I noticed it around 2 a.m., sitting at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee I probably didn't need. The house was quiet except for the fridge humming and the occasional creak from the floorboards. I'd been meaning to do some work on the backyard garden, but everything was done for the night. And the only reason I was up was because I couldn't sleep. That's when the motion light outside my back door clicked on. I swear I heard it before I even saw it flash, like a faint electrical snap. I froze, looked at the window, but the yard was empty. No trees swaying, no animals rustling. Nothing. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed for the motion sensor. It was one of those standard Wi-Fi security cameras with a night vision mode. The screen showed the backyard in grainy black and white. I tapped the live feed, half expecting to see a raccoon or a stray cat. Nothing. Completely empty. I leaned closer to the screen and noticed the timestamp in the corner. It had jumped forward 6 seconds. I blinked, thinking maybe the camera was just lagging. I refreshed the feed, but it did it again, another 6-second skip. The light was on, yet nothing moved. No one, no animal, no shadows shifting. Just the light, bathing the yard in that harsh, cold glow. I got up and went to the back door. The yard was silent, empty, completely normal. I checked the fence line, the hedges, the garden beds, all untouched. The light clicked off after about 30 seconds. I went back inside, shaking my head. Probably a wiring glitch. 20 minutes later, the same thing happened. Click. Light on. I checked the feed. Nothing. Timestamp jumps. 6 seconds forward. I considered just unplugging it, but the curiosity got the better of me. I left the feed running and waited. After a while, I noticed something subtle. The shadows of the garden furniture were shifting slightly, but not naturally. They didn't correspond with the angle of the light on the porch. I couldn't place it, like they were just slightly off. I shook it off and went back to my kitchen chair, trying not to think about it. Then it happened again. Click. Light on. Feed shows nothing. Timestamp jumps. 6 seconds. I watched the blank feed for a full minute this time, and then I noticed the grass. In the corner of the yard, the blades closest to the camera were bent over in a tiny, perfect arc, like someone had pressed down on them. But the rest of the yard was untouched, and when I blinked, or maybe when the feed updated, they were straight again. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped outside. Air was cool, the kind that makes your skin feel tingly. I shone the flashlight across the yard, sweeping methodically. Nothing. No footprints, no animal tracks, no signs of movement at all. I went back inside thinking maybe I was imagining it, but then the feed triggered again, light clicking on. Timestamp skipped. 6 seconds, and this time I noticed a faint outline at the very far edge of the yard, barely visible against the black. I froze. It wasn't human-shaped, not exactly, just a vague, darker patch, like a shadow with edges too smooth to be a bush. I blinked and it was gone. I spent the next hour watching the feed, trying to rationalize it. Could be a sensor malfunction, could be interference from something, maybe the neighbor's Wi-Fi, maybe a squirrel climbing the roof. But none of it fit. The 6-second skip was consistent. The light triggered exactly the same way. And the outline, well, it never stayed long enough to identify. By the time I finally convinced myself to stop staring, it had started raining lightly. The sound of raindrops hitting the roof was oddly comforting, a little white noise to mask the sense of wrongness. I went to bed, told myself I'd unplug the light in the morning and maybe call the company if it kept happening. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the 6-second jump, about the way the shadows bent. Something about it felt deliberate, like the yard was being observed and manipulated in a way I couldn't see. The next night, I stayed up with my laptop, watching the feed. Around 1:45 a.m., the light clicked on again. Timestamp skipped, 6 seconds. And this time, I noticed movement. So subtle, I almost didn't see it. Something crossed the far corner of the yard, a ripple in the shadows that didn't disturb the grass or the air. Just a shift, like a distortion, like the world bent a little for an instant. I reached for my jacket, planning to go outside again, but the moment I moved, the outline reappeared near the center of the yard. Not a shape, exactly. More like a dim, amorphous patch of darker night. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the camera, but my gut wouldn't let me move. And then the light went off. The timestamp jumped again. 6 seconds. I didn't leave my room for the next 10 minutes. I didn't touch the laptop. When I finally looked back at the feed, the yard was empty. No outline, no movement, no sign anything had been there. Over the next week, it kept happening. Sometimes multiple times a night, always the same pattern. Light clicks on, feed blank, timestamp skips 6 seconds. Occasionally, the subtle distortions, blades of grass bent, shadows misaligned, faint outlines flickering at the edge of vision. I tried unplugging the light. Didn't help. It kept triggering, timestamp skipping, as if the feed itself was out of sync with reality. I even moved the camera to a different angle. Same thing. I stopped sleeping in the back half of the house. Stayed in the front bedroom, closest to the street. Never turned the light back on at night. But every so often, when I passed the back window during the day, I'd swear I could see faint impressions, like the yard remembered something that had passed through it, even though no one had been there. A month later, I had a friend over, and she noticed it too. We were standing at the window, just chatting, when the light clicked on. Nothing on the feed. Timestamp jumped. 6 seconds. And for just a fraction of a second, the outline flickered at the far edge of the garden. She asked if it was a tree. I said no. She got quiet. I haven't figured it out. I've checked the wiring, the software, the camera itself. Everything seems normal, but the sequence never changes. 6-second skips, light triggers, subtle distortions. Nothing explains it. I still leave the house early some mornings, take the dog for a walk before sunrise, just to avoid being in the backyard at night. And sometimes when I'm passing by the back window, I catch myself glancing at the feed, half expecting the outline to be there again. I don't know what it is. I don't know if anyone else would see it if they were standing there or if it only shows up on the camera. I just know that whatever it is, it moves through the world in a way I don't understand, and it keeps careful track of time, even if I can't. It was just after midnight when I was heading home from visiting my brother in Salem. I'd taken Route 22 back toward the coast, a 2-lane stretch that cuts through a lot of farmland and forest. No street lights, barely any traffic. It was one of those drives where you keep glancing at the fuel gauge out of habit, not because you're low, but because the quiet feels too big, too empty. I wasn't tired exactly, just zoned out. The radio was off, and the only sounds were the hum of the tires and the faint rattle from something in my glove box. It was cool out, late August, but the kind of clear, crisp night that already hints at fall. I remember rolling the window down a few inches and smelling wet grass, maybe fertilizer from a nearby field. I first noticed the lights when I was maybe 10 miles west of Dallas, Oregon. They were behind me, small and white, spaced evenly apart, not too bright, not like high beams. I figured it was a car, but the spacing was weird. 3 distinct points of light, perfectly level. For a minute I assumed it was one of those big trucks with auxiliary lights across the grill, but the symmetry was off. Too clean. I kept driving, waiting for it to get closer so I could see what it was. But it didn't. Every time I rounded a curve, they adjusted, still perfectly aligned in the mirror, same distance. When I slowed a little, they slowed. When I sped up, they did too. That's when I really looked. The lights weren't bouncing like headlights. You know how car lights dip and rise a little with the road? These didn't. They were fixed, steady, perfectly smooth. I flicked my mirror up for a bit because it was making me anxious, but curiosity got the better of me after a mile or so. When I looked again, they were closer. Same formation. 3 white lights, equal spacing, same height. No red tail lights, no grille reflection, no outline of a car. Just 3 floating points of light following dead center behind me. I told myself it could have been a truck pulling a trailer, or maybe something with equipment on top, like a construction rig. But I hadn't seen another vehicle in 15 minutes. I slowed to about 45. The lights dimmed slightly but didn't fall back. They held their distance. I braked harder. Not suddenly, but enough that any normal driver would have closed the gap. Instead, the lights just drifted a little, adjusting perfectly. That's when it really hit me how quiet everything was. I couldn't even hear my own engine that well anymore, like the sound was being muffled. I took the next turnout I saw, a narrow gravel shoulder near a small grove of trees. I figured I'd just pull over, let the car pass, and maybe get a look at it as it went by. I came to a stop, left the engine idling, and waited. The lights kept moving toward me for another 10 seconds, then slowed, then stopped. Maybe 100 feet back, still hovering in a perfect line. They weren't touching the road. That was the first thing I realized. They were too high, a few feet above the ground, maybe more. I thought maybe fog or heat distortion was messing with depth perception, but there was no fog and the air was cool and still. I leaned out my window, half expecting to hear an engine or gravel crunching. Nothing, just the ticking sound of my car's exhaust cooling. Then the lights started to rise. Slowly, like something being lifted straight up by a pulley. No wobble, no sound. They kept rising until they were level with the top of the trees, maybe 60 feet up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The 3 points began to move toward each other, slow at first, then faster, until they met in the middle and merged into a single, brighter light. Not blinding, but enough that it threw faint shadows from my dashboard. I remember whispering, "What the fuck," under my breath, like saying it might make it less strange. The light hovered there, steady, almost like it was waiting. Then, without any fade out or movement, it was just gone. 1 second there, next second not. I sat there for a while, staring into the dark where it had been. The crickets had gone silent at some point. I hadn't noticed when. When I finally shut off my headlights, it was total blackness. I couldn't even see the trees anymore. After maybe a minute, the crickets started again. A car passed going the opposite direction, normal headlights, normal sound. It snapped me out of it. I put the car in drive and got back on the road, trying to convince myself I'd seen some weird trick of reflection. Maybe an airplane lined up just right, or lights from a distant farm. But then I checked my rear view again, and I swear for half a second, way back on the horizon, I saw a faint white glow, dead center behind me. I didn't look again for the rest of the drive. When I got home, I parked in my driveway and just sat there with the engine running for a bit. I opened my Maps app to see where that turnout had been. Somewhere near a place called Maple Grove Road, I think. But the weird thing is, the timestamp on my phone didn't line up. I'd left my brother's around 11:15. The drive should have been just under 2 hours. It was 3:46 when I got home. No stops except that one. Maybe 10 minutes on the shoulder, tops. I know how long it takes. I've done that drive more than a dozen times. The next day, I tried to go back and find that turnout. I drove the same route in daylight. There were a few pull-offs that looked close, but none that matched. No grove of trees, no gravel shoulder that wide. It was all fenced pasture or steep ditch. I even pulled up Google Street View later, trying to pinpoint it, but the images didn't show anything like what I remembered. I didn't tell my brother, or anyone else for that matter. It just didn't sound explainable. About a week later, though, something else happened that I can't get out of my head. I was backing out of my driveway early in the morning, just before sunrise, and when I checked my mirror, not the rear view, the one on the driver's side, I caught a faint reflection of 3 white dots, perfectly spaced. They weren't headlights. There was nothing behind me but my neighbor's hedge. When I turned to look directly, they were gone. I know how it sounds. Maybe I was just tired that night, or my eyes were playing tricks in the dark. But every once in a while, when I'm driving alone and the road gets empty and still, I'll catch myself checking that mirror a little too often. Not because I expect to see them again, but because I keep thinking if I ever do, I'm not pulling over this time. I was driving back from visiting my sister in Salem, heading north along the coastal route that hugs the cliffs. It was late, well past 11 p.m., and the fog had rolled in thick, the kind that makes your headlights disappear into a gray soup almost immediately. I slowed down to a crawl, leaning on the brakes more than the accelerator when I first heard it. It was faint at first, almost like wind humming through power lines, but the tone was wrong. More mechanical, rhythmic, like a motor running somewhere far above me. Not a car, not a plane. I pulled off onto a small turnout near a cluster of pines that lined the cliff's edge, hoping to get a better listen. The fog wrapped around everything, making the world feel small and soft, muffled. I killed the engine and listened. The sound was higher now, almost vibrating through the car itself. It wasn't constant, it pulsed in irregular bursts, but the intervals felt deliberate, like it was scanning or rotating. I stepped out, shivering. The air was damp and sharp with the scent of salt. I tilted my head back, trying to see through the fog, but there was nothing. Just gray and the faint whisper of the machinery above. I took a flashlight from the glove compartment, sweeping it over the trees, the cliffside, the small path that led down toward the beach. Nothing moved, no animals, no branches shifting in a pattern that suggested wind. The fog was too thick to see more than a few feet anyway. I turned back to the car, trying to convince myself it was a helicopter or some kind of coastal machinery from the lighthouse a mile down the road. That's when I noticed the clock on my dash had jumped forward almost 20 minutes. I hadn't touched anything. I checked my phone, no cell signal, but the time was still off, about 15 minutes ahead. I shook my head and muttered to myself, probably just a glitch. My mind was playing tricks in the fog. Then it stopped. The machinery sound faded until it was gone, like someone had flipped a switch. The fog didn't lift right away, but it thinned quickly, and the world around me began to take shape. That's when I saw it, or rather, what was left behind. The stars above were wrong. I've spent enough nights driving and camping to know the constellations pretty well. Orion's belt, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, they all look familiar to me. But now, as I squinted into the clearing sky, nothing lined up. Orion was shifted almost a handspan north, the Big Dipper tilted differently, and there were clusters of stars I didn't recognize at all. I blinked, thinking it might be fatigue or the fog playing tricks. When I blinked again, they hadn't moved. I got out of the car, feeling the damp settle into my jacket, and tried to match the stars to my mental map. Still wrong. The horizon looked familiar, the cliffs, the trees, the small beach cove. But above, the sky was rearranged. The machinery noise never came back, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. Not in a paranoid way, just present, like the world had shifted slightly while I wasn't looking. I drove slowly the rest of the way home, keeping my eyes on the sky. Every so often I thought I caught movement in the fog that still clung to the lower cliffs, but when I slowed down or looked directly, there was nothing, just empty air and the distant lapping of waves far below. When I got home, I parked in my driveway and grabbed the binoculars from the cupboard. The sky over my neighborhood was normal, or at least normal looking. Orion was where I expected it. The Big Dipper traced its familiar arc. No strange clusters, no shifted constellations. I leaned back against the car, confused and unsettled. I couldn't reconcile what I saw with what I knew was there. The next day, I checked a star map online, pulled up an app that tracks real-time constellations. Everything matched what I saw from my driveway. Nothing was different. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night, of the fog, of the sound, and especially of the stars. I didn't tell anyone, not even my sister. I felt like if I did, they'd just chalk it up to me being tired or the fog playing tricks or some weird combination of stress and imagination. A week later, I drove that same coastal road again. It was early evening, fog rolling in low again, but the machinery noise didn't return. The stars were normal. I scanned the cliffs and trees, half expecting to see something that explained the previous night, but there was nothing. I told myself it had been a one-off, a strange alignment of fatigue, weather, and perception. But the feeling of being off, like the world had shifted slightly while I wasn't watching, didn't leave. I've gone back several times since, sometimes at night, sometimes just at dusk, and nothing has happened. No sounds, no rearranged sky, no skipped time. The only reminder I have is in my memory, and the way my stomach tightens whenever I think about that night. I don't know what it was. I keep wondering if the machinery sound had been real, or if it had been some kind of signal, or if the sky itself had changed for a moment and then corrected itself. I still drive that route occasionally, always keeping my eyes on the cliffs and the fog, listening for that hum that never returns. I don't think it was a hallucination entirely. I remember the cold dampness on my skin, the way the fog smelled, the vibration through the car when the noise pulsed. But the stars don't lie. And yet my memory of them is different from every chart I've looked at since. That's what keeps me uneasy. Something happened that night, something I can't explain. And it wasn't just in my head. I was parked on the turnout off Highway 1, just south of Davenport, a little after 10 on a Sunday night. The fog had been heavy most of the drive, but right by the water it thinned out enough that you could see the glow of the moon on the waves. I wasn't there for any real reason, I just needed a break. I'd left Santa Cruz earlier than planned after an argument with my brother, and I didn't feel like going home yet. So I pulled over at that little spot overlooking the cliffs, turned off the engine, and just sat there with the window cracked, listening to the ocean. There's a weird kind of quiet on that stretch of coast at night. You can hear the water, but it's faint, like it's miles below you. The wind makes more noise than the surf. I remember my phone said 10:24 p.m. because I checked it before setting it face down on the passenger seat. The battery was low. I was just watching the horizon, or where I thought it was, when this really bright light appeared beneath the water. It wasn't lightning or a boat. It was deep. You could tell by how it glowed through the waves like a flashlight shining from under thick glass. At first, I thought maybe it was a submarine light or some kind of underwater drone, but the thing moved fast, way too fast. It came toward shore in this perfect, straight line. No wake, no ripple. Just a sharp white glow sliding through black water, and it didn't fade as it got closer. It actually got brighter. I leaned forward, squinting, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but the light reached the base of the cliffs and disappeared under the sand. No splash, no sound. It just went from the ocean into the land like it had tunneled beneath it. I waited for a few seconds, expecting something, an afterglow, maybe the sound of an explosion or even an earthquake. But there was nothing, just the wind again. After a minute, I turned on my headlights, mostly just to see something normal. The beams caught the guardrail and the gravel in front of me, but when I looked down toward the beach, I realized the fog was gone. Not thinned out, gone. The whole stretch of coastline that had been half covered in mist was suddenly clear, like someone had wiped a window. I could see all the way down to the rocks. That's when I noticed there was a faint line in the sand below, a kind of glowing streak that curved inland before fading out behind a dune. It wasn't bright, just a dull bluish color. I remember thinking maybe I should take a picture, but my phone battery had died. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time, debating whether to go down the slope. I finally decided to just see how far I could get. The path from the turnout winds down through some scrub, and there's a wooden fence halfway. The air felt heavier the closer I got. Not humid exactly, but dense, like the way it feels before a storm. When I reached the bottom, I realized how quiet it had gotten. The waves weren't crashing anymore. I could see them moving, but they made no sound at all. Just this dull vibration in my ears, like the pressure when you go up a mountain too fast. The glowing streak was still there, stretching maybe 50 feet before it stopped near a big piece of driftwood. The light didn't seem to come from above or below. It was like the sand itself was faintly lit from within. When I stepped closer, it faded, almost like it was reacting to me. I crouched and touched it. The sand was cold. Not just cool, freezing, like touching metal left in a freezer. My fingers came away damp, even though the rest of the beach was dry. Something moved behind me. I turned around expecting to see another car on the turnout or maybe a ranger, but there was nobody there. Just the empty road at the top of the cliff and the faint outline of my car. The headlights were still on, and for a second I could swear they flickered. When I looked back at the beach, the glowing streak was gone. Completely gone. Just normal sand, no light, no mark. I stood there trying to convince myself it had just been a trick of my eyes, like phosphorescence or something. But then I noticed something else. The fog was back, rolling in from both sides, thick, fast. By the time I got halfway up the path, I could barely see my own hands. The wind picked up again, but it was coming from inland now, not the ocean. It carried this low humming sound, deep and mechanical, but with a rhythm to it, like a pulse. I froze. It didn't sound close, but it was steady enough to feel through the ground. I made it back to my car and shut the door. The second I did, the humming stopped. Everything went dead quiet again. Even my headlights looked weaker, like the air was absorbing the light. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered. It wasn't dead, just delayed. It started on the third try. I looked at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. I'd only been down there maybe 15-20 minutes. There was no way it was that late. I started driving back towards Santa Cruz. The fog thinned out after a few miles, but the radio was acting weird. It kept cutting out, even on strong stations, and once for maybe 5 seconds, it caught something I couldn't explain. It was faint, high-pitched, not static exactly, more like a voice on a shortwave frequency, but layered. There were multiple tones overlapping in a pattern that didn't sound random. When it faded, all I could hear was the ocean again, even though I was miles inland. By the time I got home, it was just past midnight. My phone, which had been dead earlier, was somehow at 63%. The time and date were right, but when I checked the call log, there was a missed call from an unknown number at 10:37 p.m., the exact time that light appeared under the water. The next morning, I drove back out there. I didn't really expect to see anything, but the fog had burned off and the tide was low. There was nothing unusual, no marks in the sand, no footprints besides mine. But the air still felt wrong, heavier than usual, and I noticed seagulls circling way out over the water, all moving in tight spirals like they were tracking something below the surface. I stayed long enough to convince myself it had to have been something natural, a reflection, a current, maybe some kind of undersea cable. But I couldn't shake how the fog vanished right before it happened, or how the radio picked up that sound later. That night, I parked in the same spot again, just to see. I waited for almost an hour. Nothing. No fog this time, no glow, no humming. Right before I started the car to leave, though, I saw something move in the reflection of my windshield. Not a light, just a faint shimmer in the sand below, like heat distortion. It wasn't bright enough to see clearly, but I could tell exactly where it was. The same spot where the light had gone under. When I blinked, it was gone. I drove home with the radio off. I was on County Road 9, the long two-lane that runs between the highway and my sister's place, when I first noticed the air over the pavement look wrong. It was late July, a week after the heat wave broke, but the road still had that tired shimmer you see over asphalt in August. I had the windows cracked, radio low, and the stereo only gave me the low end of the song. No lyrics, just the guitar part, looping weirdly like it had been set on repeat. That was the first small thing. The song stuttered for 4 bars, the signal cut to static for a second, and then the station came back with the chorus in place as if nothing had happened. A mile or so before the long straightaway where the cornfields open up, a barn dog went off, sharp, continuous, like it had sighted a deer. The sound stopped dead at once. The silence after it felt the kind that raises hairs on your neck. I told myself it was one of those nights where everything exaggerated itself, but the oddness kept stacking. A road sign leaned where it should have been straight. The reflective paint on the arrow looked like it had been touched up in a different gloss. My phone dropped from 2 bars to no signal and back again in the space of a minute, even though I still had full bars 5 minutes earlier. I turned the corner into the straight stretch at about 45 miles an hour. The headlights cut 2 clean paths into the darkness. The corn cracked softly in the breeze to my right, the sky low and heavy, and the moon not brave enough to show its face. I remember thinking that if anything was going to happen, this was the road it would happen on. Long, empty, everything you need to feel alone, but not lost. That's when I saw it. A shape, a pale smudge, drifting a few inches above the asphalt, maybe 15 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a trick of the heat haze. Your eyes play paint with the air, make it seem like something's standing there. But this was different. It didn't blur with the road. It hovered, like a curtain of nothing, a wavering in the headlight that made the blacktop behind it look slightly off-register, as if someone had nudged the film in the projector. It had no color, no edges, just that wavering, translucent look like a mirage, except there was a cool night and no sun to put it there. I slowed. Not because I thought it was a person. There was no outline, no feet, nothing to run into, but because the thing didn't move like fog or a wisp. It drifted along the lane, keeping pace with me, but not with the wind. It slid sideways for a fraction, then came back, like it was being steered by something precise. I rattled the stick shift absent-mindedly, trying to keep my hands busy. I had the stupid thought that someone was standing on the shoulder with one of those reflective jackets and a flashlight, but there was no light glare, no reflective fabric, just that soft heat haze look, a ripple in the dark. I'm terrible at stopping in the middle of a road, so I eased forward. The shape stayed, a little less than the width of the lane, waiting. When my bumper passed through the first inch of the shimmer, the car felt the tiniest touch in the front end, like driving over a short patch of water. Not a jolt, but a dampening, as if something had passed through the tires and sucked a breath out of momentum. The engine stayed steady. The speedometer didn't twitch, but the dashboard clock blinked. It jumped back 1 minute. It wasn't the kind of blink where the display flashes and settles. The numbers reloaded and showed a time 1 minute earlier than it had been. I remember looking down because I'd been watching the clock for the last 20 miles, no real reason, and seeing the minute flip backward like I turned a dial. I laughed out loud at first because I wanted the simplest explanation. Electrical hiccup, bad connection under the dash, some glitch like phones do. But the laugh died quick. The sound the car made as it passed through the rest of that short, shimmering field was wrong. Muted, like the world had a blanket over its ears. When I glanced up, the shape had dimmed, not moved, just softened, and the patches of road beyond it looked like they were drawn slightly out of focus, like a lens out of alignment. My GPS, which had been a reliable butt-in-the-seat voice since I left the highway, had gone mute. The little blue dot that represented me on the map sat where it had been, but the map's imagined road lines jittered like a needle misreading a groove. I switched the radio off because my chest felt full and loud despite the silence. The static it left behind was loud in its absence. I drove through the rest of it, and the air inside the car smelled for a second like tin and cold corn silk, a smell that made my mouth water and made me blink as if I'd been in a smoky room and needed to clear my lungs. The tires hummed. Nothing in the dash suggested a mechanical error. Engine light not on, oil pressure steady, my phone screen was black. When I turned it on, the battery read the same as it had before I hit the shimmer. The minute was simply gone from the clock. I kept driving because there was nothing to do but keep going. I told myself I'd made a wrong turn in the perception of the moment, that I'd misread the clock while watching the road, that heat mirages can play games. But as I drove, small matters continued to be off. A farmer's pickup came the other way, and its headlights didn't paint the rows of corn. The light stopped a yard short, like someone had painted a shadow across the field in front of the truck. I pulled alongside an old mile marker, and the number on it was smudged, not weathered smudged, but rubbed off clean in a perfect circle. When I looked back a few minutes later, the marker was fine. The next morning at the diner, I told Jenna, the woman at the counter who knows everyone and stitches small talk into big afternoons, and she said two things that made the hair on my neck stand up. First, she'd had a customer the night before who swore his watch had run slow for an hour and then righted itself. Second, an older man who eats there sometimes, Mr. Hollis, had woken up with the radio on and a song playing he swore he hadn't put on, a record from the 70s that glitched and folded like it had been paused and rewound. Coincidence stacked like that makes you quieter than you think. I drove the road again a week later in daylight, figuring if it had been something with the light, I'd see what it was. The stretch was ordinary. Telephone poles, stray trash, a lone plastic chair leaning against the ditch. No sign of any shimmer, no odd smudges on mile markers. The farm dog was sleeping in the yard. Maybe, I thought, whatever it was had a ticking habit, like a shy animal, and only came out at night. I didn't tell my sister because she would tell me to stop driving the road at night, and I needed to be able to go where I'd been going. I told her about the clock when we spoke on Sunday. She said, "Maybe your dash is going bad." And I said that was probably right and changed the subject. I did go to the mechanic eventually. He checked the wiring and told me it was fine, the sort of bare verdict mechanics give when they can't find the whisper of a problem. He suggested a new battery for the clock module anyway, just to be safe, and charged me nothing because he said he liked the look on my face when I described the shimmer. What keeps me from writing it off entirely is the small, physical aftermath. No cosmic thunder, no bright light that set the fields on fire, just that mintest of adjustments. 1 minute rearranged in my day. A second later, a corner of the world that I'd been watching opened like a page and folded away. When I think about it now, I wonder what I missed in that minute I lost. Did the shape mean to reach for something? Was it an eddy of time that taxed my dash clock like a watch at the bottom of a tide pool? I don't have a theory that feels like truth. I only have the hum of the radio when it's off, the way the corn leaned that second time like someone had told it to listen, and the clock on my dash that now will sometimes hesitate for a blink when I should be sure of time. Afterward, I drove my sister's truck back home on a different route. The county promised to fix leaning signs and to replace the mile marker with a new, reflector-coated post. People at the diner told stories about lights and clocks over coffee and moved on. I go back to County Road 9 when I have to, and I try not to look for that wavering shape because looking feels like inviting. If I pass that stretch and the night is still and heavy and the way the road bends makes the headlights spill thin, I keep my hands on the wheel and my eyes forward and the radio low. My dash clock still works for the most part. Once in a while it stutters like a thought trailing off, and I glance at it out of habit and find the minute where I expect it to be. Then I drive on. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and woke me before the sound finished. I rolled over, squinted at the screen, and saw my own number staring back at me like a dare. It said video call in small letters, and there was no name attached, just the digits I'd been assigned for 8 years now. For a second, I thought I'd set it to forward or accidentally hit something in my pocket. I thumbed the green button out of habit. The screen filled with grain at first, then a dark image that didn't resolve into anything familiar. The audio came in as a low, steady rumble, like wind moving through a metal grate or distant traffic under a bridge. It had texture, a mechanical quality that made the hairs on my forearms prick up. No one spoke. I tapped the screen to flip the camera so whoever was calling could see me. Nothing changed. The rumble kept rolling like a wave under everything. The room looked wrong through my phone, darker and with a sort of slow smear where light should be. For a moment I thought the feed was from outside the house. It drifted, subtly as if the camera were moving, and when the image steadied again, I recognized the edge of my own bedside lamp, the slant of the headboard. The feed was looking at my bed. I felt stupidly exposed, like I'd left the curtains open, until I realized the angle wasn't mine. The camera was coming from somewhere above, not from the doorway. It was a ceiling shot of my own bedroom, but the mattress looked slept in a way I didn't feel. I sat up, and the rumble shifted a fraction of a decibel as if it had noticed movement. I kept the phone to my ear because that felt safer than looking at the screen. I tried to call back, hit end, redialed my own number. Rings. Rings. The call went to voicemail with a mechanical thunk that cut the rumble clean. My voicemail had no new messages. When I slid out of bed, the room smelled faintly of metal and rain. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:11 a.m. in blinking amber, which somehow made the whole thing more real. I fumbled for the light, turned it on, and the lamp came up as it always did, warm, ordinary, the glow not touching the ceiling, like the video had. My phone battery read 72%. I glanced at the feed again. The image froze on a dark blur and stayed dark even after I pulled down the notification shade. The record showed the call came from within the house. It listed my number as the caller, and then under call details it said, outgoing 2:14 a.m. My chest went hollow. That time should have been an hour plus ago. Outside, the street had that quiet that feels like a borrowed thing. No late trucks, no porch lights left on. For the past few days, our neighborhood had felt off in little ways. The clock above the pizzeria's door had skipped 5 minutes twice over the weekend. Mrs. Klein across the street had asked if anyone else's microwave had turned itself on at odd hours. Last night, the power had blinked for exactly 7 seconds and then steadied. I joked about storms coming in, but the jokes didn't land. Now it felt like a pile of tiny loose things that, assembled, made a wrong shape. I got dressed quick and padded out into the hall. My cat, Scout, perked up and came to the threshold. Her fur bristled the way she did before thunderstorms. She cut across my legs and stared at the back door like she expected to see someone there. I told myself I was being ridiculous and opened the door anyway. The air outside smelled of wet pavement and wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. In the distance, the low rumble I'd heard on the video pulsed once and stopped. I couldn't work out whether it came from far away or right under my feet. Down the block, the Joneses had left a porch light on. Their house was dark beyond that, but a thin glow framed the curtains like a late-night TV. We waved when we passed each other earlier in the week, and I'd thought nothing of how tired Mr. Jones looked. Now, I noticed his silhouette in profile at the window, and for a second his head moved in a way that wasn't quite his control. He seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. I walked to the corner where the bus stop sat and sat down on the metal bench because moving didn't make things clearer. The rumble returned, this time as a distant freight. Heavy, even. A car went by and its tires hissed through the puddles, normal and ordinary. My phone buzzed again. Same number, same video call. I didn't pick up. The phone kept ringing at odd intervals. 2 minutes, 6, nearly 10. Always from myself, always sending that same low-slung sound into the world. I started filming the front of my house with the spare battery-powered camera I keep in the hall for storms, thinking some other person's phone had been spoofing mine. The footage showed nothing at first, then a thin smear of light crossing the yard like heat over asphalt, and at the exact second the smear crossed the frame, the call log cycled a new outgoing time, 2:34 a.m. The timestamps jittered on the camera and on my phone like they were trying to agree and failing. I went back inside because I wanted to be rational and warm and physically present where my things were. Inside, the kettle on the stove was slightly warm to the touch, though I was sure I hadn't used it since dinner. The bedside lamp's cord was still looped where it always sat. Nothing was disturbed. Scout hopped up onto the bed and curled into a tight ball like she did when she wanted to be left alone, and I sat on the edge and tried to steady my breathing. The house felt inhabited by some patient thing that watched, measured, then did nothing. At 2:49, the doorbell rang. I froze. My hands were cold enough to make the metal phone case ache. I looked at the peephole and saw nothing but the dark of the porch. Through the glass, the world looked flat, drained of detail. I opened the door an inch and called, "Who is it?" My voice sounded smaller than it should have. No answer. A breeze pushed past me and I smelled salt and a faint disinfectant, two smells that do not sit together. The police came after a neighbor called when the doorbell rang again, and then the phone started ringing from within the house. 2 patrol cars idled in the street with the emergency lights off out of an excess of caution. An officer asked me for my ID, asked if I'd authorized any device to call my number, and I told her the truth. It had called me twice already, that the camera on the porch had caught something like a heat smear, and that I'd answered the first one and heard a metal wind and watched my own bedroom on the screen. She wrote it down and didn't look surprised because she had the professional training to hide disbelief. She took the laptop with the camera footage and said they'd log it. They sat in the squad car for a long time and chewed the inside of their cheeks with the sort of attention that belongs to people who wait through unlikely calls. The older one, Officer Ramirez, said, "Sometimes people spoof numbers, like that was a thing that could be typed into being and made sense of." The younger one kept glancing at his phone and back at the house and kept swallowing. I wanted to ask them if they'd ever had their own number call them from inside a house. I couldn't figure out how to ask without sounding like I had finally lost the shape of things. The phone rang again, loud and close. This time, I didn't let it go to voicemail. I hit the green button with my thumb and held the phone steady. The image filled the screen, my bedroom from above, slightly out of focus, and the rumble rolled under it like waves. But there, in the corner of the frame, something shifted. A darker patch of shadow that seemed to tilt the same way my head does when I'm thinking. The timestamp in the corner of the feed read 2:14 a.m. Again, not now, not the present. When I looked at the clock on my wall, it read 3:17. "Hello?" I said to the black glass because it felt better than listening to the hum. The rattle in the feed got louder for a second, and then the screen filled with static and the call dropped. The phone reset to the home screen with my number still listed at the top. I backed away from it like it might bite. The officers left without making a report beyond the usual line items. "We'll file it," Officer Ramirez said. "We'll check the logs." That meant the city would have a thing in a folder about a house with a phantom dial tone and a neighbor who watched her bedroom from a camera that shouldn't have been able to call itself. It felt like being given a piece of paper that would not help. I sat down at the table with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, too weak to move me. The morning light, thin, gray, started to come through the blinds. I scrolled through my camera roll and found a single new photo I didn't remember taking. Me, asleep on my side, hair stuck to my forehead, study lamp on, blanket half kicked off. The east-facing window showed the faintest blur of something outside, like fog made of glass. The file's metadata said it had been captured at 2:13 a.m. I tried to make sense of my own timeline, but couldn't. My phone said the photo was created at the same instant my own number had been calling me from inside the house. I drove to work because leaving town felt like admitting the problem belonged to me. On the way, I called Mom and told her about the calls. She said, maybe someone's pranking you, Han, or your phone's acting up. She always used the up tone when she wanted to smooth worry into normal. I saw the pizzeria's clock again as I passed. This time it read correctly. The day progressed with the small, ordinary tasks of being a person. Emails, a meeting with a client who wanted a logo redrawn, a barista who wrote my name on the cup wrong. The world calibrated itself into little predictable clicks. All of it felt like a set of parts that would, if left alone, keep the machine of life turning. That night, I locked the doors twice and left some lights on. Scout jumped up on the bed and wound herself into my side. At 11:08 p.m., my phone buzzed once and went to voicemail. No call, no log, no new files. The rumble did not return. I'm writing this down because the house still seems normal, and that alone is a kind of answer I can live with. The photo of me on the bed sits in my phone beneath the others like evidence in a puzzle. And when I scroll past it, I have to remind myself I really was there that night, in that bed, with the lamp on and the world buzzing with tiny, ordinary noises. But sometimes at 2:14 in the morning, if I wake and look at the ceiling, I swear I can hear something like wind through metal. It pulls at that logic, the most reasonable, boring part of me, and I hold the covers up to my chin like that will be enough. The power went out with one long, flat stutter. Not a pop or a surge. Just the whole neighborhood inhaling and then nothing. I was in the kitchen rinsing a coffee mug. The window opened to the back alley because it had been sticky all day, and then the sink tap stopped. The light over the stove blinked twice and died, and the house folded into that kind of dark that sounds like a full stop. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer, the cheap LED that usually lives under a pile of mail, because instinct is apparently to go find light, even though my phone should have been fine. There was a low, steady rain, the kind that starts out polite and keeps getting more serious, and the street outside was a smear of wet black. I stepped out onto the stoop, and the cul-de-sac was a bowl of dark, except for one house. It was Mr. McKenna's place. 3 flat steps, a porch swing flagged the yard with the overgrown hydrangea, and it was lit from the inside of the walls. Not lamps through windows, not a glow leaking around curtains, but the siding itself looked pale, like the plaster had been turned into a soft white light. The color wasn't electric, not the bluish glare of LEDs. It was steady and a touch warm, like an overcast sky. It didn't flicker with the storm. It didn't have the busy, flickering life of a TV or a fireplace. It was just there, a constant, gentle light that made the raindrops look like little strings of glass. My first thought was generator, someone's inverter humming away inside, but no one had that kind of inverter buried in their walls without a fan or a hose vent. I stepped off the porch and walked toward it, the street soft under my shoes. From the road, the whole front wall had that even light to it, and when I came closer, I could see it bleeding up under the soffit through the paint around the window frames. It wasn't a lamp inside pointing outward. The light seemed to come from beneath the surface. There were a few neighbors on the other corner, tinkering with flashlights and frowning at phones with no bars. Tina from across the way had her rain jacket pulled up, and she was peering at the McKenna's house like I was. "You see that?" she asked, though the thing itself said as much as a dozen questions put together. People don't stand in the rain to look at their neighbors' walls unless something about the world took a wrong turn. We used our flashlights like props, riding the surface of the house with cones of harsh white that did nothing to alter the soft glow. Tina tapped a window. No sound came from inside. The front door was closed. You could see the faint outlines of the window panes, darker boxes inside the lighter wall, but the glass itself was indistinct. If I pressed my palm against the clapboard, it felt cool, not warm, the way an interior light might heat up a thin wall. There was no hum, no generator noise, no smell of exhaust. There was, faint and almost nothing, an ozone tang in the rain air, like the half smell of an electrical storm. It made my teeth feel odd. I walked the length of the house with the others, shining lights and taking slow steps. The glow ended as cleanly as if someone had erased it with a ruler at the back wall, and the neighbor's yard behind the house was dark and ordinary. On the side where the plaster met the brick of a low garden wall, the light wrapped around with no visible source. It made no sense. We banged on the door. We called through a window. No answer. Mr. McKenna was 80 if he was a day, and he lived there with his wife, Helen. She did her errands in the afternoon and made pies for the church bake sale, and they both kept to themselves mostly. The McKennas were home that afternoon when I'd left for work. The neighbors had seen them in the driveway. The idea of them sitting in a glowing wall and not noticing seemed ridiculous until you stood in the rain and realized no one could explain what you were seeing. Someone eventually called 911 because once a crowd forms, people expect paperwork. The dispatcher sounded tired, which was fair. Phone lines were spotty and there were other calls in. The police cruiser that came was 5 minutes later. The lights off at first because it was a blackout and batteries are precious, and the two officers stood under their umbrella and stared at the house like we were all in on a secret. They knocked, too, politely. No answer. We stood there in the rain, the small ring of us with our flashlights and umbrellas, and the light in the wall didn't do more than exist. It didn't pulse. It didn't grow. It didn't leak in a way that made the curtains glow from inside. You could have painted your hand across the wood and left the low sheen paint dry. It was unbelievably ordinary in how it refused to be anything dramatic, which didn't make it any less strange. I kept watching because watching felt like work. There were small things that didn't fit. The neighborhood dogs, usually noisy and entitled about everything after dark, were quiet. We kept glancing up and seeing neither animal nor human silhouette at the windows, though the blinds were shut on a few. My phone, which had been at 80% when the lights cut, slipped to 60 like the battery was breathing out. The little digital clock on the newsstand in the neighbor's window had stopped at 9:12 and wouldn't change no matter how many people checked. The rain sound seemed fuller at the corner and thinner near the lit wall, like the air had a different density hugging it. After a while, the officer asked if anyone had keys. Mrs. Delaney from 2 doors down did. She'd been close friends with Helen in church council days and still had a spare. A man in a yellow raincoat, someone from the next block, I think, climbed the steps with keys and the cop at his shoulder and tried the lock. The door wasn't bolted. The knob turned. The porch light flicked on for a breath, and then the house swallowed light back into its walls as if embarrassed. He eased the door open and leaned his flashlight in. The foyer beyond was lit, not like the walls, but lit by ordinary lamps and a faint ceiling light on a timer. Close in, the house looked normal. Framed photos, a half-rolled rug, umbrellas in the stand. The cop called out, "Mr. McKenna, Helen," and the voice came thin and ordinary back, muffled as if someone called from the kitchen where a pot can deaden sound. "They're in here," someone said. Not the officers, but a voice from down the hall, sharp and then steady. You could hear feet padding. That changed the mood. The light was still a phenomenon, but the human element settled around it like a name. Mr. McKenna came into the foyer when he was called, slightly wet at the collar, hair a little mussed from the rain. He was blinking in a way I knew from the pharmacy, a slow, careful blink you do when you wake. Helen followed with a towel at her shoulders. They seemed fine, more curious than panicked. Mr. McKenna looked over our faces, the rain lines on our coats, then at the soft glow seeping under the doorframe and around the windows. "Is the whole street out?" he asked, voice steady. "Yeah," the cop said. "You okay?" "Fine," Mr. McKenna said. He didn't look at Helen the way someone who's just been rescued from a house fire looks. He looked at the wall like a neighbor who'd been meaning to prune a shrub. Helen wiped her palms with the towel, glanced at him, then toward the living room where the lamps were still on. "It's the house," she said, flat and not worried yet. "It's light." They accepted the flashlight and let the cop close the door again for them. People broke into small clusters on the wet sidewalk, talking in low voices. Someone had already called the utility company. Someone else the electrician they used for bad outlets. Moments like that feel like they hang in place. A watchful pause where everyone is saving their breath to see the next thing. The cop stayed for a while, took notes with one of those little pads, and asked a series of careful questions about breakers and boxes and generators. "Any odd smells inside?" he asked, the way you ask when there are smells to discover. "Power flicker before it went?" he asked. We told him the lights had dipped at about the same instant for most of us, just a halting, a stutter, and then stopped. He nodded. He seemed to know how to close a file and how to leave something open at the same time. When he left, the street felt like a stage someone had been testing. The rain kept on. Folks drifted back to their homes slowly, the way people leave a funeral visitation, and I went with them because there wasn't a better place to be. My house was dark and quiet and ordinary. My wife, Jenna, had candles and an old battery radio on the kitchen table already. She wrapped a sweatshirt around my shoulders when I dragged myself in. We listened to the radio until it broke into static for good. I kept thinking about the McKenna's walls. In the morning, I drove by on the way to work, even though the rain had stopped and the street was slick. In daylight, you could see the paint and the clapboard and the little scuff on the front step. The house looked like a house. There was no glow. Mr. McKenna was on the porch sweeping the stoop awkwardly with his broom, and Helen was arranging a small pot of mums by the railing. They were both sunburned pale from lack of sun and laughably ordinary in their small domestic gestures. We passed each other and he tipped his hat, like a man offering the world ordinary courtesies after a thing that had been anything but ordinary. When I asked him about the glow, he shrugged and said, "It looked brighter through the rain, didn't it?" We thought maybe the transformer blew. I was asleep until the cops knocked. He sounded as if he were reciting something normal: sleep, knock, wake, and I believed him. He said he'd checked the fuse box and the breakers. The electrician had been out by 9 and chalked it to something local, something transient. Moisture in the insulation or reflection or. He waved a hand like a man balancing small, uncertain theories. Something. The electrician's explanation felt like a tablecloth you threw over a stack of irregular things, so you wouldn't have to see all of them at once. No one from the utility company had a better answer. They came by mid-morning in a truck with a ladder and peered at the lines and called things nominal. They studied the neighborhood grid on their tablet and nodded at one another like people making decisions from a manual. They found no spike, no surge, no localized feed that would cause a house to light up from the inside out. The city sent a code inspector who wrote notes, took photographs, asked the McKennas whether anything unusual had been installed in the walls. The McKennas said no. They did not have new wiring, they did not have new fixtures, they did not have speakers. The inspector's tone moved through professional curiosity to a little baffled wonder, and finally he filed a report and slid into the kind of shrug that means we are done for now. That afternoon, the glow was gone. Normal electricity returned to the street with no ceremony. A transformer 2 blocks over had tripped and the grid had reset, like nothing miraculous had happened at all. The McKenna's house lit like any other house. Regular lamps and bulbs and a lamp on the hall table that blinked a few sleepy times and then steadied. Standing on the sidewalk, feeling ridiculous for having been moved, I could see the faintest residue on the outer paint where the light had been. A touch of paler sheen in a perfect rectangle by the window. It might have been rain. It might have been memory. It might have been the way a house remembers the way an afternoon sits against it. Life went on. Laundry, work, the bar with its cheap beer and sturdier hours, but there were small, stubborn aftershocks. The McKenna's cat, which used to stroll the block like a sleek mall cop, slept by their door every morning for 3 days. A few neighbors' motion lights tripped at night for no reason and then refused to turn on for another day. The little LED flashlight from my junk drawer kept blinking its battery icon even though the battery was new. Jenna laughed about it and put it on the counter like a talisman. I don't know what happened in that rain-dark hour. People nodded toward explanations as if by collectively agreeing you could make something sensible appear. Moisture, insulation, a weird reflection off a transformer, a trick of human eyes, and a storm. Those answers work if you want the world to be solid. They were fine enough for my neighbors and mostly fine enough for me. There's one thing, though, I keep thinking about, short and unnerving. For the time that the McKenna's walls glowed, the house looked like an ordinary house pretending to be something else. It refused to become frightening. It refused to do anything spectacular. It simply made the ordinary look slightly off its axis. That's the kind of thing that lingers, the kind you bring up at the supermarket in a half sentence and then drop because people are buying milk and bread and no one wants the sky to be a question. At dusk the week after, I walked by their place again. Helen waved from inside the kitchen, a silhouette behind frosted glass. The house was just a house. I stood there for a minute and listened to the street. A child laughing 2 doors down, a TV's low glow through blinds, a car in the distance. Everything was the plain work of evening. I turned and went home, and when Jenna opened the door, I felt grateful for the small, steady light of the kitchenette lamp. We ate cold pizza and watched a grainy sitcom, and the world seemed not to be made of questions for a while. I noticed the shadow the moment I turned down Willow Street. It was a narrow block in my neighborhood, old maples, narrow sidewalks, the sort of place where porches are close enough to smell someone's dinner if the wind was right. It was around midnight, a little after finished closing the bar where I bartended 3 nights a week. The air was the kind that felt like it sat on your skin. Not cold, not warm, just inert. The moon wasn't out. The sky was clear. The street lamp over the corner was one of those new LED bulbs, brutal white. It cast everything sharply. Cars, the street sign, the long, neat shadows of the trees. When I walked exactly into the lamp's pool, my shadow didn't shrink under me like it should have. Instead, it stretched out down the street, a long, dark blade over the pavement, though the light source was directly above my head. It was unnatural in a way that got my stomach tight. Not in a horror movie way, but like when a subway jerks and you lurch forward. An immediate physical wrongness. I stopped. The shadow stopped too, frozen, a foot longer than it had been a second before. I tested it. I raised my hands, and the shadow's hands went up a heartbeat later, the fingers trailing as if behind a slow-motion film. When I took a step forward, it lurched, half a beat behind me, then eased to match my pace. The lag was tiny, barely measurable, but it was there, precise like timing on a clock. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of fatigue. You see weird things behind the lens of a long night's mind. But the street was quiet, and my head was clear enough. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to take a picture. On the screen, my shadow looked normal, short, right under me. No blade, no lag. That made the thing feel stranger, like the phenomenon knew how to look normal if anything was recording. I stood in the lamp pool for 5 minutes, watching. Sometimes the shadow behaved, a small, obedient duplicate that followed immediately. Sometimes it lagged a fraction of a second, and if I took 2 steps in quick succession, it bent oddly, as if the lag stretched more when I moved faster. It was subtle and maddening. When a car came down the block, the headlight beam cut through the shadow, and it folded into normal darkness until the car was gone. The driver didn't slow down. No one else was standing there, watching. I felt uncomfortably visible. I decided to keep walking. The lag came with me, like an echo that couldn't quite catch the original. For a few blocks, things were ordinary. My breath, the scuffed pavement, the loose dog barks across the way. Then, under the next lamp, it happened again. But this time the shadow didn't just lag. It stayed long even though the lamppost was right overhead. It reached across the sidewalk and touched the hedge on the other side where no light fell. I knew the line between light and unlit pretty well. My dog used to chase lizards there. There was no natural way a shadow could reach where no light shone. I tried to make a joke to myself, muttered something about my imagination, and kept going, faster. The lag felt worse then, like a clicking gear in the skin of me. When I moved my arm to unlock my front door, the dark hand behind me moved an honest half-second after. It didn't match my movements neatly, more like it was interpolating between them. Inside the house, everything was familiar and verbally boring. The microwave clock, the living room lamp I left on for the cat, the stack of bills on the counter. I left the porch light off and didn't look at the walkway on my way in. That night, I slept badly anyway, waking to look at the ceiling like a person expecting a ceiling to rearrange itself. The next day, I told Laura about it over coffee. She worked a swing shift at the hospital. She's practical. She said, "Maybe it's your eyes or the new lamp bulbs are weird." She half laughed, tried to shrug. I felt stupid explaining the lag thing. It's an awkward thing to describe, and it didn't help that she didn't see it when we walked through the block that evening. We stood under the same lamp, and her shadow went where it was supposed to, obedient at her feet. Mine did the lag thing for a moment and then snapped back into place, and I could tell she noticed the way my mouth thinned, even if she didn't know what I was trying to say. In the days after, small oddities piled up like lint. The streetlight at the corner would flicker twice in a row at random. Brief, precise, then stay steady. My watch, which runs on a battery, ticked 10 seconds fast once and then corrected itself. The neighbor's porch radio, which sits out when he's doing backyard projects, started playing low static on and off at night. When I asked him, he said he hadn't turned it on and couldn't explain it. I stopped leaving the bar's back door unlocked when I left. Better to walk the extra block than to test what I thought was wrong. The shadow started following me even when the light wasn't directly overhead. Once I crossed an alley where the lamplight came from the side, and my shadow reached forward along the alley even though the light source should have cast it to the left. It didn't behave like a projection at all. Sometimes it blinked out like someone switched a dimmer. Once it stayed long and thin, even as I moved into a patch of bright porch light. It was like two truths occupying the same ground. I tried to get evidence. My phone wouldn't cooperate. Photos taken on my phone looked normal. A friend, Jay, came by with his old digital camera and we walked the block together. His footage showed the same normal, obedient shadow I saw on my phone. "Maybe it's only you," he said. "Maybe you got a trick eye from too many closing shifts." He sounded half convinced, and I could hear the polite alarm in his voice, like he wasn't sure whether to worry. One afternoon, I sat under the lamp and moved in tiny increments. Lift an arm, lower it, trying to map the lag. The delay wasn't the same every time. Sometimes it was a quarter second, sometimes almost a full beat. When I moved slowly, the shadow was almost there. When I moved quick, it trailed, smeared, stretched. If I stopped entirely, it would take a heartbeat and then settle into the same posture. There was a slowness to it, like a person catching up to a decision. After a week of it, it felt less like a weird observation and more like a presence. I'd be walking home thinking about nothing in particular, and then that lag would make me aware of myself in a way that felt intrusive. It wasn't threatening exactly, more like a thing waiting for permission to be relevant. Once on a rainy night when the whole street reflected the lamps in glossed, wet puddles, the shadow reached beyond me and lay across water like a finger. The puddle didn't ripple. The wet asphalt took it without disturbance. I considered moving. Not permanently, but at least away from that block. Small towns can be endurance tests when your brain wants to keep testing anomalies. But my lease was up in a couple of months, and there were application fees and Laura's job and the bar schedule. Also, a weird part of me thought if I left, I'd be admitting the world had changed in a way others couldn't see, and I couldn't quite do that yet. One night, 3 Fridays after the first sighting, I did something dumb. I stood under the lamp until the late buses had gone and the house windows on the block went dark. I wanted to accelerate the lag to see how it handled fast movements. I ran an ugly, short sprint down the sidewalk, then stopped dead at the shadow's edge and turned around. The dark on the pavement shivered and then fell into line with me. My chest was pounding. The air felt heavy like sound had weight. For a slow moment, I imagined the shadow catching up all at once and then rolling away, like a coat being shrugged off. It never did that. It matched me, late and obedient, as if it had finally learned the motion. That night, I sat on the couch and watched the news until bursts of static pushed in from the old TV. I felt foolish, the way people do after watching a sunset and then thinking the day has meaning. Laura closed her eyes and reached for my hand across the coffee table, and it felt like proof that some things were still normal. The shadow didn't stop, it changed. Sometimes it would be a little longer, sometimes it would hesitate less. Once in a dark parking lot, it refracted into something like a smear of darkness that shifted direction independently for a half second. I kept thinking there should be a pattern, but there never was a schedule I could lock down. The only pattern was that it happened more when I was alone, and then more often when I thought about it. People ask if I told anyone official, like the city or an electrician. I thought about calling someone the first few days, but who do you tell about a lagging shadow? The city sent a crew to the lamp after a neighbor complained their streetlight was flickering, and they replaced the bulb and tightened the mount. And for 2 nights, nothing strange happened at all. I relaxed. Then 3 nights later, under the new bulb, the shadow stretched as if the new light had nothing to do with it. I kept tracking it until the summer turned into the slow burn of early fall. The lagging shadow acclimated to my life the way a new neighbor does. Always there, present but not invasive. I stopped checking my phone when I stood under lamps. I stopped suggesting to people that they look up when we passed a pool of light. Part of me was embarrassed. Who wants to be the guy that talks about physics-defying dark? And then, one late October evening, the block was different. There was a power cut in the neighborhood, and for 10 minutes, the whole street was draped in real, honest dark, the kind that shuts out detail and makes you trip over the curb. I walked through it because I needed to get home, and flashlight apps on phones are always a joke. When the power winked back on, there it was, the lamplight. My shadow was exactly under me as it should be, immediate and dull and faithful. I laughed aloud in the street, a short, stupid laugh because for once I was glad of a null result. I stood there for a moment longer, just to make sure. The shadow obeyed. It followed my hand when I reached up. No lag. I walked to my door and opened it, and for the first time in months, I did not look back at the glow on the pavement. I closed the door behind me, flipped the inside light on, and listened to the normal sounds of home. The refrigerator hum, the faint tick of the mantel clock, the cat rearranging in the armchair. I haven't solved it. It didn't vanish as a spectacle to be celebrated or as a hazard where someone could point and say, "There, fix that." It's still out there when I walk sometimes, doing its little delayed mimicry, and sometimes it behaves like any ordinary shadow. Whatever it is, if it is anything more than tired eyes, I learned 2 things. You get used to the world being off, and you get used to not saying the strangest things aloud. If you walked by me now under a street lamp, you'd probably see my shadow exactly where it belongs. Maybe you'd see it lag a little. Maybe you wouldn't. I walk home anyway. The street is still the street, and the lamps still throw light. The shadow is just a slow echo sometimes, and other times it's nothing at all. I stopped expecting explanation and started listening for the click that comes when a gear finally finds its place. I set the trail camera up behind the shed because the raccoons had been getting into the compost bin every night. It was late October, the kind of cold that makes your fingertips ache, and the yard had that leaf-thin smell of fall. I didn't expect much. A few raccoon selfies, maybe a possum or 2. I wanted footage so I could figure out how they were getting in without standing out there freezing every night. The camera was the cheap one my brother gave me last year. Motion trigger, infrared, decent battery life. I mounted it about 5 feet off the ground on an old fence post where it could see the shed, the compost, and a strip of the wood line. Set it on 3-shot mode with 10-second intervals and high sensitivity. I checked the SD card, made sure the date and time were right, and left it. Rain had been forecast but held off. The night was clear and quiet. I didn't really expect to be surprised when I pulled the card out the next morning. I had coffee in my hand and the dog at my feet, and I was thinking about calling my boss when I clicked the first folder open on my laptop. Every photo was the same. Not the same as in same raccoon in different poses, but literally the same thing in frame after frame. a faint column of light descending from the top of the photo toward the ground. It wasn't a streak or a comet. It was a soft, vertical shaft, like someone had hit a long, pale droplet of moonlight against the trees and let it slide down. On some frames, it reached all the way to the compost bin. On others, it stopped a few feet above the grass. The camera's night vision rendered it in pale gray and white, so the column looked like smoke made of light. At first, I thought the camera was glitching. I scrolled through the images, 1, 2, 300 of them in sequence, and the column was there in almost every shot. The timestamps ran from 2:07 a.m. to 2:31 a.m., 3-shot bursts every 10 seconds like I had set it. Battery voltage read normal in the file headers, no low power warnings. The SD card showed plenty of space. Nothing else in the photos moved much. The shed silhouette, the tree line, the dark bulk of the compost, no animals, no headlights, just that column. I called my brother and left a voicemail because it felt ridiculous to talk about. "You have to see this," I said into my phone. He answered an hour later, half asleep and trying to be helpful. "Maybe light from a house? Someone walking with a spotlight?" he said. I told him the neighbors' houses face the road. Their lights don't point into our yard. There are no houses north of the property line. The only road for half a mile is the county lane, and those photos show the column directly over the yard, not the road. I went outside with the laptop on impulse because you can get a different feel standing where the camera stood. The air was thin and raw. The leaves crunched under my boots. I couldn't smell anything unusual. The dog sniffed at the compost like he does every morning and then sat down and stared at the fence post. He was quiet in a way that set my teeth on edge. Neighbors had smart lights and ring cameras on their porches. I walked down to Claire's place across the lane and showed her the images on my phone. She's practical, a nurse, the sort who gets called for real emergencies. She tapped the screen, frowned, and suggested we drive the lane to see if any house's lights might line up oddly with the camera. We drove slow. Nothing. No construction lights, no cars had been in the lane that night. Claire checked her security footage and said it was empty. I put the images in a folder and stayed with them all morning. On the 25th photo, the column was slightly wider, like the top had unfurled. On the 32nd, it had a faint, darker core, something inside it that the infrared camera rendered as a softer shadow. On the 48th, it shivered sideways as if some wind blew through it, but there was no motion blur elsewhere. The shed's shadow didn't move. The only thing that changed was the shaft itself, frame by frame, descending like a slow elevator. By noon, I'd convinced myself of 3 things. The camera didn't lie about what it saw, the neighbors didn't account for it, and it wasn't on the ground when it began. The column resolved a few feet above the compost in some shots, then touched down on bare grass in others, and then it was gone altogether later in the sequence. There was a gap of several images where the exposure looked the same, as if the camera had taken a break. Then the column appeared again farther to the left, not quite vertical. I backed up copies of the SD card and printed a couple of frames to show people. That felt like old-timey evidence, which I suppose it was. That night, I took the camera in, charged new batteries, and set it again on the same post, switching it to video. I wanted to catch movement to see whether the column had any sound or motion I couldn't infer from stills. I climbed the fence, tightened the strap, and felt stupid doing it. The sky overhead was star-pricked and clear. The owl called twice in the trees and then stopped. I went to bed with my head full of maybe and probably not. At 3:17 a.m., the motion alarm on my phone buzzed. I sat bolt upright. My phone had been on the nightstand, muted, but the app gave a vibration even on silence. I ran downstairs and opened the video file. The footage was shaky. I kept the camera on the post earlier than any rules would recommend. An honest amateur. The first minute was blank trees, black grass. Then the column dropped down from the sky, slow at first, then faster, a quiet, luminous rope moving through the air. It didn't make a sound the camera caught. Audio was a thin line of static. The column's edge looked clean and distinct, and for one breath length, the way it slid toward the compost made the hairs on my arms stand up. It met the ground, and the ground under it lit like paper under a lamp, but there was no scorch mark or steam. I grabbed my coat and stumbled outside. The temperature hit my face hard. The night smelled like cut grass and nothing else. I walked the path the camera had seen and knelt where the shaft had come down. The grass around the compost felt normal under my palm. Cold, damp with dew, no burn, no crushed blades. I took a torch and shone it in a circle, looking for footprints or melted grass. Nothing. The dog walked around in small circles and then lay down and watched me. He didn't whine, he didn't bark. He just watched. I told myself I'd sleep better knowing I'd seen it on video. That lasted about 2 hours. The next morning, I took the SD card to town to get it copied to a flash drive, and the attendant at the small tech shop said his system wouldn't read the file. Corrupt, he said. But the thumbnails look fine. He nudged the drive toward me, and I could see the same pale column in the tiny preview. He charged me $5 and said, "Weird thing. Probably a codec issue. Happens all the time when people use older cams." I tried not to read the late-night messages that the neighbors sent each other. Somebody asked if the raccoons were finally building a spaceship. Somebody else wrote a joke about crop circles. But there was a second voice in a private message from Rosa, the woman who runs the feed store down the road and knows about animal behavior. She said, "My Tom, your place quiet at night?" She'd noticed the chickens had been skittish and her barn cat had refused to go out for 3 nights. Heavy silence in her voice. We agreed to meet at mine after dusk and walk the perimeter. Rosa brought a second camera, one of those battery-powered game cams that shoots a sequence of high-res images. We set it to snap every 5 seconds and left it facing the compost again, a different angle so we could triangulate anything that appeared. We sat in the truck with the heat on and sat there for a long time, talking about nothing. The air smelled of diesel and stale coffee. At around 1:40 a.m., the truck radio fuzzed, but there was no signal, only a thin ringing in the speakers that felt like the end of a dial. Rosa swore softly and turned it off. The feed from the extra camera came back with 2 things. 1, a dozen photos of the column descending, like a ladder of light taking up the frame sequentially, perspectively consistent with the camera position. 2, the SD card's clock had somehow shifted during the sequence. The times stamped on Rosa's images were off by exactly 9 seconds between the start and the end of the column's appearance. I rubbed the back of my neck and told Rosa that this was the bit that got to me. Not just the thing itself, but the way time hopped around in logs and files, like a file had been edited by a hand that didn't care about our clocks. We took the cameras down the next morning and pored over the frames on my kitchen table. I printed a sheet and pinned them to the corkboard. The column's base blurred in the photos immediately below the point where it met the ground, but there was no evidence beneath it that anything had been there. No smudging on the compost lid, no displacement of soil. The frames, after it vanished minutes later, showed nothing different about the grass. If something had been on the ground, it had left no trace. Later that week, I put out the camera again on different posts. If it was animals, they'd show up everywhere. If it was whatever that column was, maybe it would come from another direction. The following morning, I found photos of the column again, but this time it appeared not over the compost, but beyond the wood line, between 2 trees where there's a hollow and the land slopes down toward the creek. The angle was wrong for any street lamp. There were no drone flights in the logs, and the neighbor across the fence swore he slept through the night and had not shown a beam in our direction. Every time the column showed up in the camera's frames, it behaved the same way, descending from the dark, touching or almost touching the ground, sometimes appearing to lean as if it were searching for something. Once it spread out at the base like a hand laid on sand, then narrowed and vanished. The camera files would be fine, then glitch, then come back with more frames. My email inbox filled with messages from people who had seen the images and wanted to know what we were doing about it. Some wanted to help. One guy from 2 towns over asked if he could mail me a thermal unit. I declined. It's been 3 weeks now. I left the latest camera up because I couldn't help myself. The dog follows me to the fence post and sits patient and fixed-eyed. The compost lid remains closed. The neighbors joke in a way that wants normal answers. I keep going out at dusk to stand where the camera stood and look up into the tree line and the patch of sky above it, waiting for any hint of movement that would make sense. Sometimes the yard is just a yard. Sometimes the feed shows a streak of light across the top edge, which I can explain as a plane or a meteor. Sometimes, and this is the thing that keeps my hands from steadying when I make coffee in the morning, the camera's SD card will load and the first 2 images will be blank, then the next 20 will have the column, one after the other, clean as a script. No footprints, no scorch, no sound. Just a record on plastic that says, in pixels, this happened. I've stopped leaving the compost lid open at night. I check the lock on the gate twice. The dog sleeps near the door. Friends ask if I'm thinking of calling someone official. But who do you call about a quiet column of light that descends without leaving a mark? The forest authorities would laugh me out of the office. The university people would want to put a suite of detectors up and ask me to sign waivers. I've done what I can. More cameras, different angles, backups of the files in triplet. The pattern repeats, and the questions don't get any better. Last night, the column showed up on a camera I'd left pointing at the creek mouth, where the ground falls away and water runs hidden under driftwood. On the images, it came down the same way, the lower frames catching a faint ripple along the surface of the water like a wake that was not made by something crossing above it. I stood there with Rosa at my side, both of us looking at the sequence on the laptop, and felt something like vertigo. The creek sounded normal outside the door, thin and steady. The dog paced and then lay down and watched the darkest tree. I don't know if I'm waiting for an answer or for the lights to stop showing up at all. All I know is what's in the files, and the files say the same thing over and over. A column of light descends from where there isn't any source visible, lingers as if assessing, and then folds away. It's a small, private glitch in my life that would be silly to fear if it didn't rearrange the quiet of the yard when it happens. I still put the camera up most nights, partly because I want to catch something that will explain it, and partly because I don't want it happening without me knowing where to look. If anything changes, I'll write it down. For now, I keep loading the SD cards, backing them up, and looking at the pale columns in sequence until the pixels blur together. I had the drone up over the field when the feed went to static. I wasn't doing anything dramatic, just a quick sweep to check the fence line and the irrigation wheel before the next day's shift. The farm's been mined for 3 years, out past the county road, where the sky sits wide and flat, and I like to fly the drone at dusk, because you can see the lines better against the evening. I parked my truck on the track, engine idling, windows down a crack. Gus, my blue heeler, lay on the tailgate and watched the little screen on my controller like he understood it meant me being away from the house for even longer. The drone had been behaving like a drone, smooth, a little buzzy, obedient to the stick movements. I was about 200 feet up, maybe 70 yards out from where I was sitting, pointing the camera down the middle of the field. The feed showed the furrows, the fence posts, one lone rusted irrigation wheel near the east end. I panned left toward the tree line, and then the screen went fuzz, like somebody had dragged a thumb across it, and then nothing but a blocky gray hiss. At first I thought it was interference. Phone calls drop out here sometimes, and that stretch of highway can get a cell tower hiccup. I fiddled with the antenna, nudged the transmitter, and cursed at the screen like a man trying to wake a sleeping kid. The controller's telemetry still showed the drone's altitude and battery, everything nominal, but the video was gone. I hit record out of habit because even a bad feed can sometimes salvage a frame or two when it reconnects. The time on the controller read 8:11 p.m. The drone hovered, motors steady. The field was quiet enough, a few frogs near the temporary pond, a long, low sound from the highway in the distance, and the soft cotton of the clouds rolling in. I told myself to relax, that it was probably a temporary glitch. The farm tech I'd talked to in town had said those cheap channels get noisy at night. When the picture finally came back, the color balance was wrong, flat and cold, as if someone had dialed the saturation down. My stomach tightened, because at first glance there was nothing strange in the frame. The furrows, the irrigation wheel, the fence line, the slight dark shape of my tractor half buried in the tall grass. Then the camera tilted, and right there, centered in the frame, was a silhouette standing in the middle of the field. It was a black shape against the paler ground, the right height for a man. It looked like someone staring up at the drone, which made sense in a grain of salt, common sense way. What didn't make sense was the position. That black shape was standing maybe 10 feet from the east fence post, which was at least 100 feet closer to me than the truck where I was actually sitting. I glanced at my tailgate reflexively. I was practically in the driver's seat. Gus lifted his head and cocked it like he was hearing a high-pitched note. I leaned forward and zoomed in on the feed. The silhouette didn't have any features, only a simple outline: head, shoulders, arms hanging. It wasn't waving, didn't move. The drone's map overlay, burned in the corner, showed the craft hovering in the same GPS spot I'd left it, and my little blue dot, the controller's idea of where I was, showed me sitting in my truck exactly where I had been. I tapped the return to home button more out of muscle memory than anything. The drone beeped acknowledgement but didn't move. I told myself to take it serious and not panic. I killed the engine with a finger because an idling truck felt foolish when all that was going on. Gus whined like he wanted me to do something he'd recognize. I set the controller down on my knees and stood up, stretching, because standing felt like the right thing to do before I walked back into the field. The moon was behind a bank of clouds and the light was thin and blue. The silhouette in my feed stayed where it was, utterly still. I walked the path toward the fence. The controller pinged me occasionally. Telemetry, battery checks. The drone's altitude read 210 feet. My walk wasn't fast. I didn't want to alarm anything. I kept scanning the ground as I went, thinking the silhouette would be a person, maybe a neighbor out late, a hitchhiker, somebody checking the boundary. I got to the east fence post and there was no one. There's a small low ridge that runs there. You can see it from the track, but you have to be right on it to get the angle. I stood on it and looked back toward the field, toward the drone. All I could see was a rent of lighter ground where the grass lay compressed in a patch the size of a coffee table. The grass wasn't burned or trampled like a person had paced through it. It was only settled, crushed in a perfect oval. My phone buzzed in my chest. A text from Marco, the kid who works the next farm over. "You still out?" it read. I typed back "now" and left the message sent but didn't hit the send button. I had to check the feed. I lifted the controller and the silhouette was still there, and only then did I realize the timestamp on the video had jumped. The controller clock read 8:11 when the feed cut. On the screen now, the recording time showed 8:24 p.m., a full 13 minutes since the glitch. But I'd been walking for maybe 2 minutes. The horizon had a different slant to it. The clouds looked slightly farther along. Something about that time shift felt like a slap you couldn't hear. I kept talking to myself, checked the GPS on the controller. It matched the drone. I looked at the map overlay that gave the drone's coordinates, and then I looked at my phone's GPS, and the little blue dot was where the truck had been in the track, exactly 200 feet away. The silhouette remained inert, like someone had left a shadow there and walked away. I took another few steps closer to where the video showed the figure standing. My boots pressed into the soft ground, and I noticed then that the compressed oval of grass made no imprint where someone would have stood. No scuff marks, no footprints, nothing to tell me anything had been there at all. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like after lightning but without thunder. My scalp prickled. For a second, my mind toyed with rationalities. Night vision or heat signature. No, the silhouette was flat black, not thermal. A trick of the camera? Maybe. But why would a camera trick only at that one spot? Why would the drone's timestamp jump forward? Why did the video resume with a static hiss and a single perfect outline in the frame centered as if placed? I climbed back into the truck, half cursing, and set the controller down. The feed remained live, and I watched the silhouette even as I sipped cold coffee. The image was too crisp, too deliberate. I panned the drone slowly. The silhouette didn't change location. When I tried to zoom and focus, the controller stuttered, and then the screen skidded into a bar of white for a heartbeat, and then showed the silhouette again. But now, it seemed a hair taller, though that could have been the zoom. Gus, who'd been growling softly in his sleep on the tailgate, sat up and put his paws on my knees. His eyes were fixed where the feed showed the figure. He whined and slipped off the tailgate to circle the back of the truck as if finally realizing something was outside that I couldn't see. By the time my neighbor Marco pulled up, he'd come because everyone knows you don't leave a farmer with a weird feed alone. It was 8:33. He asked me what I was doing and I pointed at the screen. He watched for maybe 10 seconds and didn't say anything. He squinted, made the fishing line face he does when a problem needs a solution, and asked if the drone could be broadcasting something. I told him it was a simple model. It didn't do overlays like that. Together, we walked over to the patch again. We peered down at the flattened grass. Marco knelt and pushed at the soil. Nothing. He said, "Weird" once, and as if to prove it, his phone chimed with a notification. A news alert from the small county app. Power disruptions reported. Residents advised to report unusual activity. Someone else had seen something, or at least blamed the grid. He tossed his phone to me like a hot potato. We tried to call it back to the home point. The drone reached for us like a lost thing and then started to descend. The controller beeped and the map showed a new track. The drone dropping in a slow spiral toward the oval where the silhouette had been. I felt my throat tighten. My thumb hovered over the pause land buttons. When the video feed cleared, the frame showed a view of the ground. No person, no figure. The drone's shadow passed over the pale oval, and the grass lifted and settled in its wake, no different than any other. We walked the field until the drone landed, and then I took the controller and played the footage back. The file recorded the static, and then the clear silhouette, and then 13 minutes forward. There was a single extra frame at 8:24:12, a grainy blur where, for a split second, there was the impression of legs, like someone had moved, but that frame was only a smudge. A file repair utility later said nothing could be recovered beyond that. Marco tried to joke to break the tension, but his laugh was thin. He stayed until the truck's heater had warmed my hands and his coffee was gone. He said he didn't like being out here alone and left me with a pat on the shoulder that felt less like neighborly reassurance and more like a dismissal. I packed the drone into its case, even though the battery still had 27%, and slid into the driver's seat. Gus thumped his tail against the cab like a snore. On the drive back toward the house, the headlights picked out deer in a distant hedge, eyes like spilled coins. The county app pinged again, a terse notice about multiple reports of unusual visual phenomena, no verified threats identified. The local volunteer fire page had one line of chatter about cameras glitching and strange silhouettes, and that was as official as it got. At the end of the night, when the coffee had cooled and the barn cats had claimed their laps, I watched the footage again on the laptop and tried to scrubbing through the frames to make it something I could solve. The silhouette was still there in the middle of the field, exact as before. The clock in the footage read 8:24, and my truck's dash still said 8:11. The metadata on the file listed creation times that didn't make sense, and recovery software kept truncating the same section, like something deliberately kept half hidden. I told myself a dozen plausible things. Drone firmware glitch, GPS leap, compression artifact, sleep deprivation, a prank caught in a bad angle. But in the kitchen, with the soft hiss of the refrigerator and the cat's indifferent rumble, none of those things sat right. The field felt normal when I drove it the next morning. The flattened oval had puffed back up like nothing had happened. No footprints, no sign of a person. The only remnant was a thin copper taste in my mouth that didn't belong to coffee. I kept the footage backed up on 2 drives and read the forums, because that is what you do. People argued about paranormal and technical possibilities with equal conviction. Some others had found oddness in their cameras that same night, scattered in towns a few counties over. Nobody had an answer. I started checking the field at odd times, an hour before dawn, an hour after sunset. Sometimes the air would feel like someone had exhaled near my ear. Sometimes it would be just wind and the smell of cut grass. 4 nights later, a grain truck rolled down the road at 2 in the morning, and the whole house woke with its rumble. I checked the feed, and the silhouette was gone. The drone battery that night drained normally, the file timestamps behaved, the world matched the clock. I still fly the drone because there's always something to check. Fences rot, irrigation wheels seize, farm life nags at you if you don't look. But when I send the craft up now, I sit with my thumb hovering over the pause button and the return to home like it's a lid on a jar. Gus watches the screen too sometimes, head tilted in that way that shows he hears more than he can tell. Every so often I scrub through the footage from that night and stop at 8:24 on the file and stare at the black shape in the middle of the field, the stubborn silhouette that has no name and no explanation, and I try to figure out whether I was in the truck or in the frame first. I woke up to the sound of birds, which is normal for me since I keep my windows open in the spring. But when I rolled over and glanced out the bedroom window, something immediately felt off. My backyard didn't look wrong at first, just the usual patchy grass, tomato plants starting to leaf out, and a few wildflowers I hadn't gotten around to weeding. But then I noticed the tomatoes, and the peppers, and the basil. All of them were rearranged. Not in any casual sense, like I'd walked through and brushed them a little while watering. No, they were organized, perfectly, in concentric circles around a small patch in the center of the yard. The plants weren't bent or damaged. They weren't uprooted. Nothing was missing, just moved. Precise, symmetrical circles, like someone had taken a compass and measured it all out. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was dreaming. I've had dreams where I water plants and come back to find they've grown 10 feet overnight or turned colors. But the light in the backyard was natural, dawn light, gray and soft. It wasn't dreamlike. I got out of bed and went to the window again, staring for a while. The soil in the circles looked the same as the surrounding soil. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I opened the sliding door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, grass cold and wet under my feet. Every circle was perfect, not a single plant out of line. My first thought was my neighbor. Roger's a practical guy, always tinkering in his garage. Maybe he'd wandered into my yard trying some kind of experiment. But then I remembered, the circles weren't random. They spiraled outward from the center, spacing identical from one circle to the next. No human would do that without measuring tools, and even then, it'd be hard to get that precise without leaving some evidence, footprints, flattened grass, something. I started pacing around the yard, looking for anything else. The garden gnome was untouched. My compost bin hadn't been moved. Even the small rock path that cut through the herb bed was exactly where it should be. Nothing else felt wrong, exactly. Just the circles. I called my friend Tanya, a botanist at Iowa State, to see if she could make sense of it. I figured she'd laugh or tell me plants can somehow self-arrange overnight. She didn't laugh. She sounded a little tense. Concentric circles, she asked. Like perfect ones? Yeah, not a plant out of place. Nothing's dead, nothing's uprooted. It's just moved. There was a pause. Then she said, that's not natural. No plants do that, not by themselves. And unless someone had a surveyor's level and some serious patience, there's no way it was human either. I hung up, unsettled. Part of me wanted to ignore it, tell myself I was seeing patterns where there were none. But that didn't explain the subtle differences in the soil. The ground inside the circles seemed slightly more compacted, almost like it had been pressed down but not trampled, not like a footprint. More uniform. I spent the morning taking pictures, every angle, every layer of circles. Even zoomed in, I couldn't see any sign of disturbance. No debris, no broken stems, nothing. Just perfect geometry. Later that afternoon, I went to water the garden. I left the hose running across the lawn while I went to grab the nozzle, and when I returned, the circles were still there. I squatted next to one, reaching out to brush a leaf, and the plant felt normal. Soil soft, roots intact. Everything seemed alive and fine. By the evening, I had started questioning my own memory. Maybe I'd done it myself in a half-asleep state. But that didn't explain the center point, a tiny patch of bare dirt, perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, right in the middle. I'm meticulous about planting. If I wanted bare dirt there, I'd have planned it. But I didn't. I checked the security camera footage from the front of the house. Nothing. No one entering, no cars stopping, no shadows moving across the yard. The only movement was me stepping into frame to check the mailbox. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept imagining the circles expanding, spiraling outward until they covered the yard or the whole neighborhood. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, precise and unbroken, stretching into infinity. The next morning, the circles were still there. I didn't touch them. I just stared for a long time from the kitchen window, drinking coffee I didn't really taste. Everything else in the yard looked normal. Birds landing on the fence, the wind moving the tree branches. But the circles stayed perfect, almost glowing in the soft sunlight. I asked Roger if he'd seen anything unusual. He was fishing in the creek with his grandson, not paying attention. I asked if he'd done any experiments, anything with lights or measuring tools. He shook his head. Not a thing, Nick. I swear. Why? I didn't tell him the whole truth. I just said something about strange frost patterns I'd read about in the Midwest, mostly jokes online. He shrugged and went back to fishing. For the rest of the week, I avoided the backyard as much as possible. I watered from a distance, let the hose dangle over the edge. The circles stayed the same. I tried not to think about it, tried to rationalize. Maybe a new fungus that affects plant growth in a radial pattern. Maybe frost damage reversed by early morning sun. Maybe a prank I hadn't caught on video, but I couldn't get past the symmetry. Perfect circles, perfect spacing, nothing missing, nothing dead, no signs of human or animal intervention, and no sound, no vibration, no hum in the air. I started keeping a journal, just notes on the plants, their health, any changes in light, wind, temperature, but nothing changed except that my anxiety grew. Sometimes late at night, I'd get up to glance out the window and the circles seemed slightly brighter under the streetlights, like they were aware I was watching. It was probably just my imagination, but I'd catch my breath anyway. By the second week, I went outside carefully and measured the circles. Each ring was identical in width, the center perfectly aligned with the corner post of the shed. I even used a string to check the radius of each circle. Every measurement was exact to the millimeter. I've tried to rationalize it truly. Maybe it's some weird natural phenomenon, maybe some animal or insect I don't understand. But nothing I know of moves plants in precise geometric patterns overnight. Nothing. Eventually, I stopped measuring and just accepted the yard as it was. The circles remained unmoving, unaffected by wind or rain. The plants thrived. My tomatoes produced as usual. Basil smelled sweet in the mornings. And still, when I step outside and look down at the perfect spirals, I feel like I'm not alone, even though no one has been there. I haven't tried to recreate it, and I haven't told anyone else except Tanya. And even then, she just shakes her head and says, I don't know, Nick. I still wake up some mornings thinking I'll find them gone. But they're always there, waiting as precise as the day I first saw them. I was finishing the night shift at a security company in Buffalo, covering one of the older industrial parks along Riverside Drive. It's mostly empty warehouses now, a few of them rented out for storage, some abandoned for years. My routine was simple. Walk the perimeter every hour, check cameras, make notes, radio in every so often. Usually uneventful, and I preferred it that way. It was mid-September, one of those nights where the air is cool but humid, with a low cloud ceiling that made everything feel dim and pressed down. The streets outside were deserted, except for the occasional truck. Around 1:15 a.m., I was in the main office, reviewing the live feeds from cameras mounted on the roofs. I remember drinking my last cup of coffee and noticing that everything looked normal. Empty lots, a few blinking lights on the rooftops, shadows stretching from the old street lamps. Then I saw it. Camera 5, the one covering the north side of the complex, showed a bright light coming down over Warehouse 12. At first, I thought it was a reflection from one of the lampposts or maybe a truck's headlights, but there was nothing on the street. The light hovered just above the roof, completely still, and it wasn't yellow or white like normal bulbs. It was almost bluish-white, soft at the edges but intense in the middle, like someone had jammed a flashlight into a fog. I froze. I watched it for a good 30 seconds before I grabbed my radio to check with dispatch. "You seeing this?" I said, keeping my voice calm. No response. They must have been busy at another post. I called the front desk line. No answer. I realized I was alone in the building. The light pulsed once, then twice, very slowly, like it was breathing. I reached for the zoom on the camera, trying to get a closer look. The footage jumped a little, static interference maybe. But the light remained. What got me was that there was no source, no wires, no vehicle, no anything. The warehouse roof underneath was dark, nothing moving. I thought about heading outside to see it with my own eyes, but the feeling I can only describe as wrong hit me. It wasn't fear exactly, just uneasy, like the hairs on your arms standing up when something is off. I stayed inside and kept watching. After maybe 2 minutes, the light started to move. Not fast. It drifted a few feet forward, then hovered again. Then, without warning, it seemed to disappear frame by frame on the monitor. 1 second it was there, the next, fainter, then gone. I paused the feed and rewound it. Every frame I went back, it was the same, pulsing slightly, then fading. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the north exit, curiosity winning over caution. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was dark. The lamps overhead flickered from the humid air, and there was nothing, no glow, no noise, nothing. The buildings were empty, the ground dry, not a puddle or disturbance. I walked along the edge of Warehouse 12, shining the beam over the roof and walls. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no evidence of anyone being there. The air smelled like ozone, though faint, just enough to notice if you stopped breathing for a moment. I don't think it lasted more than 30 seconds, but I remember stopping and just breathing, trying to process it. When I turned back to the office, my radio crackled. Dispatch was back online, asking if I was okay. I said yes, trying to keep my voice casual and didn't mention the light. I went back inside, rewound the camera feed again. I noticed something else, the timestamp. The light had been on camera for about 2 minutes, maybe a little more. I checked the wall clock. I had lost maybe 20 minutes. I don't know if I dozed off or what, but the sequence of events didn't match the clock. Trying to explain it rationally, I thought maybe it was a reflection, maybe an aircraft. But the light was too low for planes and the airport radar shows nothing. Helicopters would make noise. Drones? Possible, but there's no way one could hover so close to those roofs without being noticed by anyone else, especially without lights or a sound. I kept an eye on the feed the rest of the night. Nothing else appeared. The rest of my rounds were quiet. I did my checks, wrote up the incident report in my log, only noting strange light on camera, no source identified, and headed home at 5:30 a.m. That morning, when I walked out to my car, the fog from the river hung low over the asphalt. The whole industrial park looked the same, old warehouses, cracked concrete, empty. I stopped at the gate for a moment, half expecting to see that blue-white glow again, but it never came. I tried telling my friend Greg, another guard, what happened. He laughed it off, said I was probably tired or seeing reflections, but when I showed him the footage, he got quiet. He said he didn't know what to make of it, but he agreed it was weird, the pulsing, the way it disappeared. I've gone back to that post a few times since, always at night, nothing. Cameras are fine, rounds are fine. I watch for the light, half hoping, half dreading it. Sometimes, when the mist rolls in from the river, I swear I catch a faint shimmer in the corner of my eye, just enough to make me pause, but it's gone before I can focus. I haven't told anyone else at work. Don't want them thinking I'm crazy. I keep the footage on my phone, but every time I look at it, I get that same uneasy feeling. It's like the light knows I'm watching, even if it's not really there anymore. The thing is, I'm not sure if I want to see it again. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. That soft, pulsing, hovering glow in the middle of the empty warehouses, the way time seemed to stretch. It's one of those nights that just lingers. I still drive past Riverside Drive sometimes, late at night. The industrial park looks ordinary, dark, empty, silent. But every so often when the fog rolls in, I swear I see something flicker between the buildings. I tell myself it's just a trick of the lights, a reflection, my imagination. But I don't think it is. Not entirely. I woke up with the room bright but not like morning, like the blue of a phone screen pressed against your eyelids times 10. My blinds were shut all the way. I knew because I always sleep with them latched down, the cheap Velcro on the edges making that little sound when you pull it. I sat up, heart doing the dumb thing it does when you realize something is off, and the light slid across the ceiling in a soft, slow wash. It wasn't harsh. It was more like someone had set a pale blue lamp behind the house and left it on, except there was no lamp and the sound of the world was wrong. When I pushed the blankets down, the smell hit me. Ozone. sharp and metallic, like after a lightning strike, but no thunder. It made the back of my throat fizz. I leaned toward the window and touched the slats. Cold vinyl. No gap. The light didn't change when I tapped them. It just kept bleeding under the edges, painting the curtains that color you get in an X-ray film. I checked my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit and went black and lit again like it couldn't decide. Battery read 42%. That felt wrong. I'd put it on the charger at 11, and I always keep it topped off. The clock said 3:07 a.m. I shut it off because I didn't want the little glow messing with my eyes, and stood there in the blue, breathing shallow, trying to pretend it was some power transformer somewhere. I told myself the smell would go in a minute and that I'd laugh about being spooked in the morning. The cabin creaks at night. This place does that. Thin floorboards, old insulation. So I listened for familiar noises the way someone checks locks. But that night there was nothing besides the light. No gulls, no distant boat motors, nothing. It felt like the house had been put in a bubble. After a few minutes, my knees decided they were tired of being propped on the bed. I went to the kitchen, passing the little living room window that looks toward the rocks. The blue seeped out under the blinds there too, softer. The kettle on the stove, cold, showed a thin film of condensation on the spout like frost. I flicked the overhead and the bulb hummed in a way it doesn't, a tremor under the pitch. The digital clock on the microwave had blinked 3:07 as well, and now it read 3:09. Somewhere in my head I reached for explanations. Failing charger, a transformer surge, some neighbor with a spotlight, but none of those fit. On the way back through the hallway, I rounded the bookshelf and nearly tripped over the dog. Rosie had been asleep low to the floor, but she'd lifted her head and was staring at the ceiling, ears pricked, the collar tag hanging still. She made that little anxious sound she makes when thunder's coming, and it made my palms sweat. I crouched down and she pressed her shoulder under my hand like she wanted an anchor. Animals react before we do. I knew that. If she was keyed up, that said something. I opened the back door a crack and the blue thinned out like someone mellowed a projection. Outside the deck rail, the ocean was black, flat, nothing reflecting back. No lights out on the water. The air tasted like the harbor where the fishing boats keep their lines, but cleaner, with that faint tang of electricity. The neighbors' houses up the hill were dark. Shutters closed. I closed the door again, and the smell stayed a beat longer, like a note that doesn't quite stop. I tried to call the town line at the marina to ask if someone was running a floodlight, but my phone wouldn't connect. Calls spun and dropped. The landline by the kitchen wasn't much help either. A thin ticking and then dead silence. For a minute, I had the ridiculous image of the whole town going into a collective power nap and me being the last one awake in a blue-lit world. The smell faded finally, like someone rolled up a window and pulled it away. The light didn't snap off. It softened and retreated toward the window strips until only the corner of the curtain was washed. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the color was gone and the room looked like itself again, neutral and mostly normal. Rosie collapsed with a big sigh and went back to sleep. I sat on the couch with my mug and tried to count something logical. There were little odd things that had happened all week, and I hadn't put them together until that moment. The porch motion sensor had pinged my phone twice at 2:50 a.m. on Monday, and then nothing showed on the camera, just a corrupted white frame. My refrigerator had hummed louder than usual on Tuesday night, and my neighbor, Tom, had texted me at midnight saying his dog went nuts for 15 minutes, then quieted. I thought those were coincidences. Now they looked like preface. I walked up to Tom's house later that morning. He's the only person, as far as I can call, with any consistency. Knows the tide book, knows when the ferries are late. He was on his porch in a flannel, and he blinked when I told him about the blue light. "Funny you mention it," he said. "I thought I was imagining things." My son came in crying at 3 and asked if the sky had turned blue. I figured fireworks from the festival, but it was weird quiet too. He rubbed his jaw like the time he'd woken to foghorns on a glass sea. Smelled like metal here too. Kinda like when the transformer on Main gets cooked, but there was no outage. We walked the lane, and I noticed the roadside grass flattened in a neat crescent near the lower rocks. No scorch marks, no singed edges, just the way dew sits when something heavy has pressed it down and left it. When I crouched, the blades popped up under my fingers as if they'd been used but not damaged. Ordinary, unusual. That was the phrase that kept circling in my head. That afternoon, I went to the harbor to see if any of the fishing guys had seen anything. Dan at the bait shop poured coffee like it was an act of faith and listened while I described the room glow and the smell. "We saw some weirding on the radio that night," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Faint buzz on the VHF for like 10 minutes. Guys on deck thought maybe the storm was back, but no cloud." He told me a story about the lights on a buoy going white for a sliver and then normal. No one had film. No one had anything to show me. That evening, I tried to recreate something reasonable. I sat on the porch and left the cabin lights off. Rosie lay at my feet, and the water kept its low, regular sound. I watched the horizon, watched the hilltops. At 2:50, the ferry horn sounded 3 times, the ordinary call and response, and then everything went still. Nothing brightened, nothing hummed through the air. Whatever had been earlier didn't arrive again. Over the next few days, other small things turned up. A length of fishing net on the beach, draped in a perfect semicircle as if someone had folded it there and walked away. A patch of my lawn by the shed where the grass was slightly warmer to the touch at dawn, though I'd left sprinklers off. Electronics acted like someone had tapped the house. My router reset for no reason at 2 in the morning one night. The little LED blinking back to life with a timestamp 2 minutes different from the wall clock. Each item alone I'd accept. A router glitch, a kid's prank, the creak of old wood. Together, they nested into that morning's blue like birds finding the same tree. I'm not the kind of person who makes a big deal of being unsettled. I've got a mortgage and a job, and I fix things with superglue and duct tape. I don't look for mysteries. But the way that light filled the room, color without intensity, presence without noise, felt deliberate, as if something had wanted to be noticed just enough to wake someone, then gone without leaving a scrap. I told myself to stop watching the clock at night. I tried not to listen for a hum. For a week, I kept the blinds up and the porch light on like a bad security measure. Rosie seemed fine most days, but she would sometimes stand at the window and stare down past the cove, ears perked. Once she whimpered quietly and wouldn't move until the gulls started. I began to wake up some nights and check the room, and each time find it ordinary. On Wednesday morning, a woman from town came by asking if I'd seen anyone out on the rocks at 3 in the morning. She and her husband walked a lot, and she was careful with language. She said she thought she saw a silhouette against the blue and that it felt colder where she'd stood for a second. Her husband had smelled something the way Tom described. Ozone, pennies. She showed me a photo she'd snapped on her way home from a late shift. The sky in it had a sliver of color raw and blue and then was gone in the next picture. "It looks like someone was drawing with light," she said, but no one was there. I don't have a tidy ending. No official report came back that explained anything. No government notices, no utility company statements, no weather anomaly. The town bulletin had 3 messages about errant GPS readings around that time and a ferry report of a short VHF interference. The harbor log had an odd entry. Unidentified light observed, duration 7 minutes, no contact. They wrote it like a fact and left it at that. A few nights later, I woke to Rosie pawing my hand. It was daylight, strange and early. She had mud on her paws, but looked at me like she wanted to go out. I pulled the blinds and there was nothing, just the gray morning and the harbor boats yawing with the tide. No blue, no scent. The one thing that stuck was that metallic smell, which I could still summon in memory like conjuring a snowball. Sharp, clean, and impossible to hold. I kept thinking of the blue washing across the ceiling, the way it didn't so much illuminate as settle into the room like a second, cooler air. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit anything I could name. I went back to my routines as best I could. I checked on the harbor log every week. I asked around at the bait shop and at the post office. People shrug, but a few of them would meet my eye like they expected me not to stop asking. No one got a picture that kept. No one could point me to a cause. We've all moved on to normal things. Fixing a gate, a kid's baseball game, someone needing help with a flat tire. Still, sometimes at night, when the wind sounds like a distant freight and the house is just about asleep, I stand in the doorway and look out toward the black water. I wait for that tiny pulse of ozone to wake my nose. Mostly it doesn't come. Mostly it's ordinary. But when the moon hits the cove just right, there's a moment the water lightens and the house feels like it might be warm on the inside and cold on the outside. For a second, I can almost see that pale light again, held like glass over the roof. And I wonder whether it ever was a light at all, or something else, choosing to be a color I didn't have a name for. I got the call around 9 the next morning. I was sitting in the parking lot outside work, drinking the end of a coffee that had gone cold, when my coworker, Megan, called. Her voice was weirdly casual, like she was trying not to sound too interested. She said, "Hey, did you see those lights over your house last night?" I said no, kind of laughing, because I thought she was joking. I live out in the west part of town, near the edge where it starts to turn into farmland. No streetlights, no traffic noise, nothing but fields and a couple of older houses. She told me she and her boyfriend had been driving home around midnight, and when they passed the road my neighborhood's on, they saw what looked like a bunch of orange-white lights hovering over the tree line. Like 5 or 6 of them, she said, perfectly spaced apart, not blinking. I told her she must have seen a plane, or maybe one of those light formations people make with drones, but she swore it wasn't that. They weren't moving, she said, not even a little. Then they all just faded out. I brushed it off, but what stuck with me was that she knew exactly where I lived. She described the turnoff by the old mailbox with the dented side. There's no mistaking it. She'd definitely seen something over that area. When I got home that evening, I checked my phone. It had been plugged in all night, but the battery was dead, like 0%. I thought maybe I hadn't seated the charger right, but when I picked the cable up, it felt warm, like it had been plugged in and drawing power. I plugged it back in, waited a minute, and it charged normally. That was the first thing that felt off. The second came when I checked my porch camera later that night. I only have one angled toward the driveway. Around 12:07 a.m., the feed cut out. The motion log showed it recording right up until that time, then nothing for about 40 minutes. No error, no alert. It just skipped. When it came back online, the street looked darker than usual, like the exposure was struggling to adjust. There were no cars, no people, no weather issues, just a quiet, empty street. I told myself it was a connection glitch. But that night, while I was sitting on the couch watching TV, I noticed this faint humming sound. It wasn't loud, just steady, like a low electrical buzz. It reminded me of the sound old power transformers make. I muted the TV, thinking maybe it was coming from the fridge or the AC unit. But when I walked into the kitchen, it got quieter. Then, near the window by the sink, I realized the hum wasn't coming from inside the house. It was outside, faint, but definitely there, like it was hanging in the air somewhere beyond the fence. It lasted maybe a minute. I stepped onto the back porch and stood there, trying to locate it. The sky was clear, no wind, no bugs, just still air and the faintest vibration of sound that I could feel more than hear. And then, just like that, it stopped. The night went back to being completely quiet. I probably wouldn't have thought about it again if the same thing didn't happen the next night. Around 11:30, that same faint humming started again. This time I went straight outside with my phone, thinking maybe I could record it, but my phone glitched. The camera froze as soon as I opened it. The screen went black for a few seconds before it restarted. By the time it came back on, the sound was gone. I texted Megan and asked her what exactly she'd seen that night. She replied about 10 minutes later, "We thought you were out there. The lights were right over your house. Looked like you had spotlights on or something." That threw me. My house doesn't have any outdoor lighting besides the porch lamp. I asked if she took a picture, but she said she tried and her camera wouldn't focus. All the lights came out as smears. That weekend, I decided to check the backyard during the day. I don't know what I was expecting, but I walked around looking for burn marks or tire tracks or anything unusual. There wasn't much, except for a faint, circular patch in the grass that was flattened more than the rest, about 8 feet across. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking. The weird thing was, the blades weren't dead or burned, just bent. The pattern was too clean to be wind. That night, I brought my lawn chair out and sat by the back fence with a flashlight and a beer, waiting to see if anything weird would happen. For the first hour, nothing did. Then, around midnight, that same humming started up again, but higher this time, like it was directly above me. The sound wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It just filled the space. The trees at the back of the yard started to shimmer slightly, like there was heat distortion around them. I killed the flashlight and looked up. The stars were visible, but something was blocking a few of them. A faint outline, darker than the sky, not moving. I only noticed it because of how still everything was. The crickets had stopped. The air felt heavy. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp flash of light came from behind the tree line. Not bright enough to blind me, just sudden and white, like a camera flash from a distance. I flinched and instinctively checked my phone to see if it captured anything, but the screen was blank, completely black, even though it was still on. After maybe 10 seconds, the screen came back and the clock showed 41 a.m. I looked around, confused, because I could have sworn the hum had just started a few minutes ago. But when I checked the beer can, condensation had dried and it was warm to the touch. I went inside. My heart was pounding, and the whole house felt off, like the air pressure had changed. I remember the lights in the kitchen flickering when I turned them on. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard that faint hum again, but it was hard to tell if it was real or in my head. The next morning, I noticed something strange in the grass again. The circular patch was still there, but the blades that had been bent before were now standing straight, and the ground underneath felt slightly warm, like sun-warmed concrete. It had been cloudy all morning. I texted my neighbor, Tom, to see if he'd heard anything weird the past few nights. He said no, but he mentioned his dog had been acting strange, pacing near the back fence, whining at the sky. A couple of days later, I checked the porch camera again. That same gap in footage appeared, but at a different time, 11:59 p.m. to 12:40 a.m. When the video resumed, the timestamp glitched for a second and jumped forward exactly 2 minutes. The last thing I did was try to take a picture of the yard where the circle had been, but when I opened my photo gallery afterward, the picture wasn't there. The newest photo on my phone was from 2 days earlier. I didn't tell anyone else at work about it. Megan asked a week later if things had stopped being weird, but I didn't know how to answer that. The following Sunday, my power went out around midnight. No storm, no warning, just a full blackout. When it came back about half an hour later, the microwave clock was flashing 2:43 a.m. The next morning, my phone battery was at 1%, even though it had been fully charged before bed. I plugged it in and noticed the metal part of the charging cable was faintly warm again. I haven't heard the hum since then, but sometimes, when I'm outside late at night, I look up and realize the sky over my house feels emptier than it used to, like something's missing. I took Gus out because he started whining at the bedroom door about 3 in the morning, the kind of persistent, annoyed whine that means business. The house was the same as always. One story, a sagging porch light, the faint glow from the neighbor's living room across the yard. It had been a hot week and the nights were still thick. The air felt like someone had left a damp blanket over the street. I fumbled for my slippers, clipped on his leash, and went outside without turning on any lights because I didn't want to wake the house up more than it already was. The moment I stepped off the porch, the sound hit me, low, slow, and so regular that for an instant I thought it was part of the house settling, that familiar creak you get after the AC kicks off. I walked to the back of the yard and paused because the sound didn't belong to the house. It came from above, like something breathing very, very deep in the sky. Not a gust of wind, not a truck idling far away. A steady inhale-exhale that rolled across the back fence and under the old maple tree. Gus stopped tugging and planted his paws, ears forward. He looked up the way you look up at a storm on the horizon if you're trying to guess where it will break. His tail went still. He didn't bark. The sound wasn't loud. If anything, it felt too big for the night and too distant to be right there with us. but it had a presence that made the hairs along my forearms rise. I listened for the ordinary things that would explain it. Airplane? No. Planes make a turbine whine and move. This breathed. A generator, the hum from the neighbor's shed, was a steady mechanical noise I knew by heart. This had a shape. In, out, slow and patient. I put my hand flat on Gus's back and realized my pulse had synchronized with that exhale without meaning to. That did not help. I live in a small subdivision out by the river. It's the sort of place where people leave chairs on porches and wave as they pass. Usually at night you hear crickets and the occasional car. This night the crickets were muted, like someone had turned down a track. The neighbor's radio, usually a low buzz on his back deck, cut out. The streetlight on the corner blinked twice and stayed on, bright as a watch face. I made the mistake of looking at it in the silence and felt the world narrow. Everything seemed held a little too still. I went to the top of the porch steps so I could see more of the sky and squinted up between telephone wires. Nothing obvious. No moving lights, no flare of a helicopter. The stars were muted by humidity. The sound kept breathing. It made me aware of the small things around me. The way the maple's leaves didn't rattle, the way the trash can lids down the block were unnaturally still. Gus whined again and leaned into my leg. Eventually, I went to the street to see if anyone else was out. Mrs. Garza next door had her blinds cracked, one light on in the living room. I waved and she shuffled out onto her stoop with a cup of coffee and that look people get when they're trying to decide whether to be afraid. When I asked if she heard anything, she said, "Like a faraway wail?" in a voice like she was testing the words. That made me laugh, partly because the comparison was ridiculous and partly because it was the best description I'd heard, a big, slow breath that didn't belong to anything I knew. We stood in the faint porch light and listened. The breathing rolled past us again, and Mrs. Garza pointed toward the field across from her house, where the highway eased into the bend. "It's out that way," she said. "I thought it was a storm, but there's no wind." She told me she'd heard it once before last month, briefly, and then it stopped. "No one I called believed me," she said. "You're the first one who came out." Across the street, two boys were on bikes with phones out, recording. I could see the small white screens punch through the fog like fireflies. They had a kind of excited terror, the look teenagers get when something breaks their expectation of a safe night. "It sounds like breathing," one of them said into the camera like he'd been given the line. He held the phone up to me and asked if I wanted to listen. The recording, when I heard it later, had a low bass wobble that made my chest move, but it was thin through the device. The reality of it in person felt much more stubborn. I walked my loop around the block while Gus sniffed the gutters as if they might contain an answer. The sound didn't change pitch or pace, it simply moved. Or perhaps we moved with it, like a tide. When I crossed the small wooden bridge over the creek, the sound seemed to lay itself over the surface of the water, and I could see tiny ripples arrange themselves in silent symmetry. A heron flew low and then stalled mid-air in a way that made my stomach lurch. It did not call, it did not flap hard, it just adjusted and then continued on as if a metronome had told it how. About 20 minutes into the noise, my phone started to act weird. The compass app spun for a while and then showed me the direction to nowhere. My flashlight mode sputtered bright and dim a couple of times, though the battery was full. I texted my sister a quick, half-joking, "You up? You hear something?" because telling someone else made it feel less like I was losing my grip. She didn't reply right away, and I realized later she'd seen nothing from her place in the city. She told me the next day her phone had been fine. The oddities were local. Back at the house, I found other little things. The porch motion sensor, one of those cheap stick-on jobs, had a log entry for 2:43 a.m. showing motion detected, but the camera recorded only a white frame for that time. I stood on the porch and watched the tree line and tried to reconcile the footage with my own sense of time. It's embarrassing to say you keep an eye on a motion sensor, but when your night gets bent sideways, you start trusting gadgets because they're rational. Except that night, they weren't. The sensor's log said the thing had been there while my own body remembered being still and listening. At one point, I walked out into the field opposite the houses, short grass, a slope into the highway ditch. and I believed briefly that if I got away from the built world, I might get a clearer sense of what it was. The breath in the sky was fuller there, as if proximity mattered. Birds settled in the hedgerow with a synchronized rustle that made me think of curtains closing. A fox crossed below me and paused on a knoll like an audience member. The air tasted faintly metallic, not sharp, but present, a copper tang that made my teeth feel odd. I thought about calling the police because it felt increasingly like an event that could be dangerous if misinterpreted, an aircraft in trouble, some impaired giant machine. I dialed, then didn't. The voice on the line told me when I finally asked that they'd had panicked calls from 2 neighborhoods over about a deep hum, but nothing official. If it's an aircraft, the operator said, "We'll get a notice. Usually there's an alert." There wasn't. The county scanner on the volunteer firehouse came back clear. No distress calls, no emergency equipment out on the highway. That made me wonder if whatever it was chose not to show up on the things we use to prove things. Around 3:30, the sound shifted a fraction, not in rhythm or in volume, but in its relationship to us. The inhalations seemed longer and the exhalations gentler, like something rimmed the sky and laid its chest over the neighborhood. We went quiet in the way you go quiet when you're listening to someone else's secret. Gus leaned against my leg and made a small sound. He was nervous but not frantic, like he was bracing for something. From my kitchen window, I watched one of the street lamps flicker in slow beats, not quite in sync, like someone might be fidgeting with the switch. The next street over, a pair of headlights swept down the road and slowed. The driver sat motionless, windows fogged, watching the sky the way you watch slow traffic. 2 blocks away, Mr. Patel stood in his pajamas on the steps with a blanket and a flashlight. No one had moved in a way that said panic. People were out and watching, like a town looking up for a meteor that's part of a larger, quieter script. Then, very suddenly, the breath stopped. I mean stopped. The inhale didn't complete, the exhale didn't fade. One moment the sky had that low rhythm, and the next minute there was this looseness in my chest where the sound had been. The crickets came back with a sharpness as if too loud after that silence. Dogs barked and then were quiet. Someone laughed nervously a ways down the block. My phone vibrated with messages from neighbors. "You hear that?" "Yeah. WTF." The logs on a few of the cheap cameras showed the same white frame at the moment it stopped, like the devices had blinked and missed it. What stayed with me was the absence. A presence that big leaves a hollow in ordinary noise. The air tasted like anything after an electrical storm, clean but with that ghost of copper, and then it faded. I led Gus back inside, and he seemed to take a long step into normalcy, as if re-entering the house fixed him. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to write down times and details while they were fresh, because memory is a sieve, and small things slip out first. I made notes that night about the compass, the motion sensor, the fox, the crickets dropping out. I wrote down the time the breathing stopped, and the little things people had stood in their doorways to report. I tried to find a pattern and found only the shape of people who had stepped outside in the middle of the night and listened. In the morning, the sky was the color of empty glass, and the neighbors went about their routines like nothing had happened. Someone put a lawn chair back on the porch. Kids rode bicycles. The volunteer firefighters posted a message online saying they hadn't found anything that would explain calls about a hum. The motion sensor logs stayed odd for the cameras that had them. White frames, little gaps in the footage, like a recorded wink. I told my sister about it later that day over coffee. She nodded and said, "Weird." And then we both started offering mundane explanations. Thunder from a distant storm, a pipeline machine, someone testing equipment. They were reasonable things to say because most nights have reasonable answers. Mine felt like something that stepped into the neighborhood long enough to let us notice it, and then stepped back out without asking anyone's permission. I still take Gus out at odd hours sometimes, mostly because he likes the extra sniffing time, and sometimes because I can't shake the feeling that the world might cough again in the night. I watch the sky on those walks and listen harder than I used to, because listening is one of the few things you can do that matters then. Mostly there's only the dog's breath and the neighbor's refrigerator and the slow hourly traffic of life. Every now and then, when the wind is wrong and the air tastes of copper, I stop and hold my hand to my chest to see if my pulse will suddenly match a sound I don't expect. And I wonder, without wanting to know too much, what it was like to hear the sky breathing above the houses.